Silas Vane didn't knock. He never knocked. That was the thing about men who owned everything in a town they stopped. Pretending doors were anything other than suggestions. He walked into the Redemption Bluff post office on a Tuesday morning, dropped a leather glove on the counter like he was dropping a verdict, and told Postmaster Greer to hold any incoming letters addressed to Elias Crow. "Hold them," Vane said. "Lose them if you have to." Greer stared. "Sir, that's federal." "I know what it is." Vane picked up his glove. "I also know what you owe the bank. Do we understand each other?" Greer said nothing, which meant yes. That decision made in under 30 seconds by a man who had never once gone cold or gone hungry would put a mother and her 2-year-old daughter on a train platform in a blizzard with no one waiting for them. It would nearly kill them both, and it would change everything. Silas Vane thought he owned. If you've ever had to choose between what was safe and what was right, stay with this story. Because what happened next in Redemption Bluff that December is the kind of thing that makes you question what a person is actually worth and who gets to decide. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if they make you feel something real, please subscribe to this channel and hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The last train to Redemption Bluff arrived 40 minutes late, which in December on the frontier meant the difference between inconvenience and catastrophe. Elias Crow had not come to the station to meet anyone. He had come because Harlan, who ran the feed supply out of a converted stable on the edge of town, had sent word that a partial order of grain and salt had arrived on the morning freight, and that if Elias didn't collect it before the storm hit, Harlan would sell it to someone else. That was how things worked in Redemption Bluff. Nobody held anything for anybody. Credit was a rumor, waiting was a luxury. Elias had left the ranch before sunup, driven his wagon through 8 miles of frozen road, and arrived at the station to find that the freight car had been unloaded wrong, and his supplies had been sent on to the next stop by mistake. Harlan shrugged. Elias stood in the cold and did the math he had been doing every day for 3 years: what he had, what he owed, what he needed, and how none of those numbers ever came out right. 41 years old, he had 10 acres of land that used to be 60. He had a cabin with a patched roof, a barn with 2 horses and 4 cattle, and a debt to Vane's bank that had been growing quietly for 2 years like rot inside a wall. He had no wife, no children, no one who would notice, particularly if he didn't make it home through the storm. He was turning back to his wagon when he saw her. She was sitting on the bench at the far end of the platform, the bench nobody used because it faced away from the station house and caught the full force of the wind off the open plain. She was sitting the way people sit when they have stopped fighting something. Her back was straight but rigid, not composed the straightness of a person who had gone very still because moving hurt. Her dress was dark and thin for the weather, the kind of dress that might have been practical in Boston in October and was a liability in a Dakota blizzard in December. She had a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders and pulled forward, and bundled inside the shawl, pressed against her chest, was a child. Elias almost kept walking. He told himself later that he had almost kept walking, and he believed it, because it was the kind of thing a man admits to himself when he is trying to be honest. He was cold. He was disappointed. He had 8 miles of frozen road ahead of him and nothing to show for the trip. The woman was a stranger. The frontier was full of strangers who had made bad decisions and ended up in places they shouldn't be. But then the wind shifted and he saw her face. Her lips were the color of a bruise. Not pale, actually blue. The particular blue that happens when the body has been fighting the cold for a long time and is starting to lose the argument. Her eyes were open but barely focused, moving in that slow scanning way of someone who is not fully conscious of what they are looking for. And the child in her arms, he couldn't see the child's face, but the small legs hanging below the shawl were not moving, and the feet, in thin leather shoes that were completely wrong for snow, had gone the color of ash. Elias crossed the platform in 8 steps. "Ma'am," he crouched in front of her. "Ma'am, look at me." Her eyes found him. It took a moment. I'm waiting," she said. Her voice came out wrong, too slow and too careful, the way speech gets when the jaw is partly frozen. "Someone is supposed to. There was supposed to be someone here." "How long have you been sitting out here?" She blinked. "The train was, I don't know what time it is." He put his hand against the child's back through the shawl and felt the small, shallow movement of breathing. Still alive, barely warm. "What's her name?" "Elsie." Something came back into the woman's eyes when she said it, a sharpness, a mother's alertness that cuts through cold and exhaustion and confusion. She is Elsie. She's breathing. We need to get both of you inside right now." He straightened up and looked around the platform. Station house door was 15 feet away. Can you stand? She tried. Her legs did not cooperate. She made it halfway up, and then her knees buckled, and Elias caught her by the arm before she went down. The child made a small, weak sound, not a cry, more like a murmur, the sound of a child too depleted to cry properly, and the woman's arms tightened around her instinctively even as she was falling. I have her, she said. Don't take her. I have her. I know you do. He kept his grip on her arm. I'm not taking her. I'm going to help you both walk to that door, okay? Stay with me. He got them inside the station house. The station master, a thin man named Potts, who kept his office warm enough to cook in, looked up from his desk with the expression of a man whose quiet afternoon had just become complicated. She's been on that bench, Elias said. How long? Potts had the decency to look uncomfortable. She came in on the afternoon train. Ask me if anyone had left a message, for she gave a name. Crow, the woman said. She was standing against the wall because she didn't trust her legs enough to cross the room to a chair. She asked if there was a message for Clara Whitmore. For Elias Crow, the room went very quiet. Elias looked at her. Clara Whitmore, he knew that name. He knew it because it was written on a letter he had sent 8 weeks ago in response to an advertisement in an Eastern paper. A letter in which he had described his ranch and his situation with more optimism than honesty, because that was what a man did when he was trying not to die alone on 10 acres in Dakota Territory. He knew it because he had received one letter back, in a careful hand, from a woman in Boston who had described herself as a widow with a young daughter, skilled in household management, willing to work, not afraid of hardship. He had written back. She had written back. There had been 3 exchanges in total, and then a letter saying she had purchased her ticket and would arrive on the 14th. The 14th was today. He had never received that last letter. He had been waiting, and no letter had come, and he had assumed, he didn't know what he had assumed, that she had changed her mind, that something had come up. He had told himself he wasn't particularly surprised. You came, he said. It came out stupidly, like he was stating the obvious because he was. Clara looked at him. Her face was beginning to thaw in the warmth of the station house, which meant she was beginning to shake, which was actually a good sign. Shaking meant the body was still trying. She was younger than he'd imagined from her letters. Mid-20s, maybe, with dark circles under her eyes and snow melting in her hair, and the particular look of someone who has been managing their own fear very carefully for a long time, and is now very close to the edge of what careful management can hold. I wrote to tell you the date, she said. I didn't receive it. She absorbed that. I waited 3 hours, I asked Mr. Potts if anyone had come asking for me. He said no. She glanced at Potts, who found something interesting to look at on his desk. I didn't have money for the hotel. I thought perhaps if I waited a little longer. 3 hours, Elias said again. He looked at Potts. You saw a woman with a child sitting on that bench in this weather for 3 hours, and you didn't. I offered her to wait inside, Potts said, which was a lie so transparent it hung in the air between them like smoke. Elias let it go, because the alternative was saying something he would not take back, and he needed Potts to be cooperative. I need blankets, whatever you have. I've only got the one. Then get the one. He turned back to Clara. Elsie had roused slightly in the warmth and was making small sounds against her mother's shoulder, confused and frightened and not fully awake. Clara was rocking her automatically, the small constant motion of a mother who has been doing it so long it happens without thought. Your daughter, Elias said. How old, too? Clara's voice was steadier now. She'll be 3 in March. He looked at the child's face, finally visible, now that the shawl had loosened in the warmth. She had her mother's eyes wide set, dark, a little too alert for a child who should have been asleep. She looked at Elias with the frank, unfiltered assessment that 2-year-olds perform on strangers, apparently decided he was not immediately threatening, and turned her face back into her mother's neck. Mama, Elsie said. I know, baby, I know. Potts brought the blanket, a thin gray thing that had seen better decades, and Clara wrapped it around Elsie without hesitation, leaving herself in just the wool shawl. Elias took off his coat. It was the only heavy coat he owned, a canvas duster lined with sheepskin that he had bought second-hand 3 winters ago and maintained with the kind of care you give things you cannot afford to replace. Put it around Clara's shoulders. She looked at him. You'll freeze. I'll be moving. He said it with more confidence than he felt. My wagon is outside. I need to decide something, and I need to decide it fast because the storm is getting worse and we have 8 miles of road. She waited. Elias was not by nature a man who deliberated. He had learned, from years of ranching on a shrinking margin, that most decisions announced themselves if you were honest about what you were actually choosing between. The choice in front of him was not complicated. It was just frightening. He had almost nothing. A cabin with 2 rooms, a fire that ate wood faster than he could cut it, Enough food to last one person through January if he was careful. He had a debt that was already strangling him. He had no business taking on the responsibility of 2 more people, one of them a child, in the middle of a Dakota winter. The alternative was leaving a half-frozen woman and her 2-year-old daughter in a station house where the station's master had already demonstrated his level of concern. "Can you ride in a wagon?" he asked. "I have blankets in the back. Won't be warm, but it'll be out of the wind." "Yes, it's 8 miles. Road's bad, I heard you. My cabin is—" He paused because there was no flattering way to describe it. "It's not what you were expecting. Whatever you were expecting." Clara looked at him with the kind of steady, measuring gaze of a person who has already recalibrated their expectations down to the floor and is standing on the floor now and is fine. "Mr. Crow, my daughter's feet have no feeling in them. Whatever your cabin is, it has a fire. That is what I need." He nodded. "All right, let's go." Getting to the wagon was its own ordeal. The wind had picked up in the 20 minutes they had been inside, and it hit them sideways when they came through the door, the kind of wind that doesn't feel like weather so much as an argument. Clara made no complaint. She put her head down and moved, holding Elsie against her with both arms, and Elias walked on her windward side because his body was larger and could block more of it, and that was just the physics of the situation. He got them into the wagon bed, nestled Elsie between 2 grain sacks that were empty but still smelled of feed and were at least something between her and the wood, and piled the remaining blankets, 3 of them, thin and worn, over both of them. Clara arranged herself around her daughter with the automatic competence of a woman who had learned to be practical long before she wanted to. "Stay low," he told her. "I'll drive as fast as I can, but I won't go so fast I tip us." "Understood. If Elsie gets worse, if her breathing changes, bang on the front board. I'll hear it all right." He climbed up front. The horses were miserable and communicated this through their body language clearly, but they moved when he asked them to, and that was enough. He turned them toward the road and pushed into the storm. 8 miles had never been so long. He kept his mind on the horses, on the road, on the sound of the wind, and the particular way the wagon moved that told him when a wheel was finding ice under the snow. He did not think about what he was taking on. He did not think about the debt, or the firewood, or the food stores, or the fact that he had exchanged exactly 3 letters with this woman and knew essentially nothing about her life. He thought about the road, and the horses, and the distance, and he kept moving. Behind him he could hear Clara murmuring to Elsie. Couldn't make out the words over the wind, but the rhythm of it was steady and low and constant, the sound of a mother keeping herself calm by keeping her daughter calm, which was its own kind of courage. They made it in just over an hour. The cabin appeared through the snow like something reluctant to be found, low and dark and unremarkable, with a thin thread of smoke coming from the chimney that told him the banked fire had held. Elias pulled the horses to the barn first, got them inside and out of the wind, because horses in a Dakota winter were not optional, and he would see to them before anything else. It took 10 minutes. Clara sat in the wagon bed without complaint, which told him more about her character than the letters had. Then he went back and helped them inside. The cabin was 1 main room and a back room barely large enough for a cot. The main room had the fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of supplies, and the particular smell of a place where a single person has been living alone, long enough that the smell has become invisible to them. Elias was aware of it suddenly, the smell of isolation, of meals eaten alone, of no one to tell you when something needed cleaning. He built the fire up. He put water on to heat. He found a cot mattress in the back room and dragged it to the floor near the hearth, and Clara settled Elsie onto it without being asked, tucking blankets around the child's small body, with hands that were shaking now from cold and from the release of the tension that had been holding her together on the platform and in the wagon. Elsie was breathing. Her color was wrong, too pale, with white patches on her cheeks that made Elias's stomach tighten when he saw them, but she was breathing. "The white patches," Clara said, following his gaze. "Frost nip, not full frostbite. I've been watching it." She said it like a woman who had learned the difference somewhere along the way and wished she hadn't needed to. "She needs warmth and rest. If it were worse." She stopped. Swallowed. "It's not worse." Elias brought a chair from the table and set it beside the mattress so Clara could sit close to Elsie without kneeling on the floor. She sat. She put one hand on the child's back and kept it there. He made tea. It was not good tea. It was the last of a tin he had been stretching for weeks, brewed weak and slightly bitter, but it was hot, and he brought it to her, and she took it with both hands and drank it without saying it was bad, which it was. "Thank you," she said. She looked at the fire. "I should tell you, I should explain." "You don't have to explain anything tonight. I came with a child who isn't yours." Her voice was level, but it was the level of someone working to keep it there. I should have been clearer in my letters. I described Elsie as my daughter, and I described myself as a widow, but I didn't. I was afraid if I was more specific about the circumstances you would." She stopped again. "You would have every right not to have wanted us here." Elias sat down in the other chair across the fire. He was cold in ways that went past temperature. The kind of cold that 8 miles in a Dakota blizzard produces, that had gotten into his joints and the back of his neck and was going to make itself known tomorrow. "You're here now," he said. "That's not an answer." "The answer I've got tonight." He looked at the fire. "Tomorrow we can sort out what everything means. Tonight you're cold, and your daughter is sick, and the storm is getting worse. Tomorrow." Clara looked at him for a long moment. He could feel her assessing him the way she had on the platform, that careful, measuring quality that he was beginning to understand was not suspicion so much as self-protection. A woman who had learned that optimism was expensive. "All right," she said finally. "Tomorrow." Elsie made a small sound in her sleep and turned her face toward the warmth. Clara's hand moved automatically to smooth the child's hair, and she stayed there, bent slightly forward, watching her daughter breathe. Elias kept the fire going. Outside, the blizzard announced itself in full, the kind of storm that the frontier occasionally produces to remind people that their presence here is conditional, that the land has its own opinions about who belongs. The wind found every gap in the cabin's boards and made itself known. The temperature outside dropped in the way it does in Dakota, in December, quickly and without apology. Inside, the fire held. He didn't sleep. Not really. He dozed in the chair with his boots on and came awake every hour or so to put wood on the fire and check that the draft was moving right. Once, close to midnight, he heard Clara start to fall asleep sitting up and jerk herself awake, the involuntary flinch of someone who was afraid to stop watching. "Sleep," he said. "I'll watch the fire." "I can't." "You're not going to help her by exhausting yourself." He kept his voice quiet. "I'll watch. I'll wake you if anything changes." She looked at him. In the firelight, with the cold and the fear and the 3-hour wait on the platform stripped away, she looked very young and very tired, and about 10 years older than young, at the same time the particular contradiction of someone who has been managing too much alone for too long. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. It wasn't accusatory. It was genuine. Elias thought about it honestly. "I don't know that I had a choice I could live with." That wasn't quite right either, and he knew it. He had a choice. He could have kept walking at the platform. He could have told himself it wasn't his problem. Plenty of men would have. The frontier produced men like that, in quantity men who had learned to cut losses, to calculate survival, to keep their circle small because small was all they could protect. He hadn't kept walking, and he couldn't fully explain why, except that the child's feet had been the color of ash, and Clara's lips had been blue in some things. When you see them, just don't give you room to look away. Clara nodded slowly. She arranged herself on the floor beside Elsie's mattress, lying on her side so she could keep her hand on her daughter's back, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep. Elias sat with the fire and listened to the storm. He thought about the letter that had never arrived, about the postmaster, about how a woman and her child had sat on a platform bench for 3 hours because a letter had not reached the man who was supposed to meet her. The frontier had its own logic about these things. Things got lost. Trains ran late. Weather intervened. He had accepted that logic for years, because it was the logic of the place he lived. But a letter didn't lose itself. He turned that thought over in his mind and set it aside. There was nothing to do with it tonight. Tomorrow, Clara had said, he would hold her to it. What he did not know, sitting in that chair in a cabin that now held 3 people for the first time in years, was that the lost letter was only the beginning. That Silas Vane, in his office above the bank with his maps and his calculations, had already marked Elias Crow's 10 acres on a diagram that showed where the new railroad would run, and had already begun deciding what to do about it. That Clara Whitmore, sleeping on the floor of a stranger's cabin, with her hand on her daughter's back, was carrying a history more complicated than the 3 careful letters she had sent, and that history was going to matter. That the morning was going to require things from both of them they did not yet know they had. Elias put another piece of wood on the fire. The storm pushed at the walls of the cabin, found them solid enough, and kept going. Inside, a child breathed, a woman slept, a man sat watch. And in the bank at the center of Redemption Bluff, Silas Vane sat at his desk with a glass of bourbon and a map, and drew a line through 10 acres that he had already decided, in the way of men who have never been told no, belonged to him. The fever came on the 2nd day. Elias had been half expecting it. He had seen enough frontier winters to know that the body, after surviving something it shouldn't have survived, often chose that moment to fall apart, as if the crisis itself had been holding things together by sheer force of emergency. And once the emergency passed, everything that had been waiting got in line. Clara had spent 3 hours in a Dakota blizzard in clothing suited for a Boston autumn. Her body had its accounting to do. She woke before dawn with a shaking so violent it rattled the cot frame, and Elias, who had been dozing in the chair again, with his chin on his chest, came awake at the sound and crossed the room in 4 steps. Her skin was burning. She was looking at the ceiling with the glassy, slightly unfocused look of someone whose internal temperature had made the executive decision that cooperation was optional. "Elsie," she said immediately. "Not help me or I'm sick." "Elsie, she's fine." He had checked the child 20 minutes ago. Elsie was sleeping in the deep recovering way of small children who have a gift for unconsciousness that adults spend the rest of their lives envying. The white patches on her cheeks had faded overnight. Color was closer to normal. "She's right there." "She's warm." Clara turned her head toward the mattress on the floor and seemed to believe him, but only partially. Her hand moved toward the edge of the cot, reaching for something she couldn't reach from where she was lying. "I can bring her up here," Elias said. "She'll fall off. Then I'll put the cot on the floor." He looked at the cot, which was a simple wood frame with a rope bottom, and did exactly that: lifted it off its legs and set it flat, which lowered it 4 inches and solved nothing structurally but seemed to satisfy some concern Clara was having. She reached out and put her hand on Elsie's blanket, and the shaking in her arm didn't stop, but her face settled slightly. Elias made her drink water. She fought him on it in the vague, directionless way of someone too feverish to mount a real argument, insisting she wasn't thirsty, that she was fine, that he should sleep. He ignored all of it with the patience of a man who had spent years negotiating with animals considerably less cooperative than sick women, and eventually she drank. He had no medicine worth speaking of. He had willow bark, which he kept for headaches, and which he now brewed into a tea that smelled like the underside of a dock and tasted approximately as good. He had a small bottle of camphor that was nearly empty. He had clean water and a fire, and his own 2 hands, which were large and not particularly gentle, but knew how to wring out a cloth and lay it across a forehead without being asked twice. That was what the next 3 days were. He kept the fire burning, kept the water hot, he kept the cloths cool, and replaced them when they warmed, and did not sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch, because someone had to watch, and there was no one else. Elsie, to his considerable surprise, took to the situation with the pragmatic adaptability of very young children who have not yet learned that strangers are automatically suspect. She sat up on the second morning, looked around the cabin with the assessing gaze of someone taking inventory, pointed at Elias, and said, "Man." "That's right," he said. She appeared to file this under acceptable and asked for food, which he provided: a piece of cornbread from the batch he had made the night before, crumbled into warm milk, which was apparently exactly what she wanted, because she ate it with the focused, total commitment of a 2-year-old who has decided something is worth her full attention. He watched her eat and felt something shift slightly in the geography of the cabin. A small thing. She was just a child eating cornbread. The cabin had been silent for a long time, and she wasn't silent. She hummed intermittently while she ate, a tuneless sound that had no apparent relationship to any known melody, talked to herself in the half-formed sentences of a child who was working out language in real time. And she looked at everything with the particular intensity of someone for whom the world is still genuinely new. He had forgotten what that looked like. Clara's fever broke on the 3rd night. Came out of it suddenly, the way fevers sometimes resolve not gradually, but all at once like a decision. Elias was sitting at the fire when he heard the cot creak behind him and turned to find her sitting up, looking at her own hands, which was what people sometimes did when they came back to themselves and needed to confirm the basic facts. "How long?" she asked. 3 days. She absorbed that. "Elsie. She's been up since yesterday morning. She's eaten every time I offered her something, which has been frequent because she seems to have opinions about what she wants, and I've been trying to learn them." Clara looked toward the back room where Elsie was currently asleep on the cot that had been moved back onto its legs now that it wasn't needed as a compromise piece of furniture. She exhaled a long, slow breath that carried 3 days of accumulated fear out with it. "You took care of her," Clara said. "She wasn't much trouble." "She's always trouble. She's 2. But there was something in her voice that wasn't quite what the words were, something quieter and more complicated than the mild joke she was making. "You should eat," he said. "There's broth on the fire." She ate. She didn't say much, and he didn't push it, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, so much as full 2 people in a small space who were still learning the dimensions of each other, being careful about elbows. The next morning Clara got up. Not got up if she was feeling up to it. She got up the way she apparently did things, which was to decide to do them and then do them. with the leftover objections noted and disregarded. She was unsteady on her feet, and she knew it, and accounted for it by keeping one hand on the wall until her legs agreed to be reliable. She assessed the cabin with fresh eyes, the eyes of someone who had been too sick to look properly and was now making up for lost time. Elias watched her inventory the space and knew what she was seeing. The cabin was functional and not much else. It was clean in the way a single man keeps things clean, which is to say the surfaces were clear and the floor was swept, but there was no warmth to it, no arrangement that suggested anyone had thought about comfort as opposed to basic utility. The shelves held what was needed and nothing extra. The table was pushed against the wall because there was no point setting it in the center of the room when only one person ate at it. Fireplace did its job, and the drafts were managed, and that was the extent of the ambition of the place. "What do you need done?" Clara asked. He looked at her. "You should rest." "I've been resting for 3 days." She said it without irritation, but with the finality of someone closing a door on a topic. "What needs doing?" he told her. Not to test her, and not because he particularly needed the help. In that moment, he had managed the cabin alone for 3 years, and he knew how to manage it. He told her because she asked and she meant it, and he was beginning to understand that Clara Whitmore was the kind of person who found inactivity genuinely distressing, who felt uncertainty most acutely when she wasn't doing something with her hands. So she cooked. The meal she produced, from what was available in his stores, was better than anything he'd eaten in months, not because the ingredients were different, but because she had some instinct for proportion and heat that his own cooking completely lacked. He ate without commenting on this, because it would have required acknowledging that he had been eating badly for years through pure stubbornness. But he ate everything on the plate, and she noticed, and one corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Elsie, reunited with her mother, attached herself to Clara's skirt and followed her around the cabin in the single-minded way of young children who have been mildly alarmed and need proximity as proof that everything is resolved. She also watched Elias with interest from this safe position, studying him with the unsubtle attention of someone who hasn't learned to pretend they're not staring. "She wants to know if you're going to stay," Clara said, catching Elias looking back at the child. "I live here, I know, but she doesn't understand that yet. She knows her father is gone. She knows we left Boston. She knows things change." Clara's voice stayed even. "She's been watching you for 3 days to figure out which kind of change you are." Elias looked at Elsie. Elsie looked back at him from behind a piece of her mother's skirt that she had balled up in one fist. Crouched down to her level, which brought him considerably below it, because he was a tall man, and crouching put him at approximately the height of a large dog. Elsie stared at him for a long moment, apparently processing. Then she pointed at the fireplace and said, "Hot." "Yes," he agreed. "Very hot. Don't touch it." She withdrew her pointing finger with the air of someone who had never been considering touching it and resented the implication. Then she released her mother's skirt and walked, with the deliberate waddle of a 2-year-old who is concentrating on the mechanics of forward motion, to the braided rug near the hearth, sat down on it, and began examining a knot in the rug fibers with intense interest. Elias stood back up. Clara was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "She'll have you trained inside a week," Clara said. "Trained how?" "She'll have you sitting on the floor with her, fetching things, making up names for whatever she's pointing at." She said it without apology, but also without entirely hiding the small amount of amusement underneath. "She has a way." He looked at the child on the rug. "I'll manage. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." Clara held his gaze for a moment and then looked away, back to whatever she was doing at the table, and Elias went to put more wood on the fire, and Elsie found something in the rug fibers that required the attention of both hands. It was, he thought, a strange thing. The cabin was the same 4 walls it had always been. The winter outside was the same winter, his debt was the same debt, and his problems were the same problems. And yet the room felt occupied in a way it hadn't before, not crowded, just inhabited. Like the difference between a fire that's burning and a fire that's actually warming something. He sat with that thought and did not say it out loud, because there was no version of saying it that didn't sound like more than he was ready to mean. They found the rhythm of the cabin in those early days, the way people find the rhythm of anything not through planning, but through necessity, by doing the same things repeatedly until patterns emerged. Clara cooked in the mornings. Elias handled the animals and chopped wood and made repairs. Afternoons were sorted between them, without much discussion, each taking what the other left. Evenings they ate at the table that Elias had moved back to the center of the room, because it turned out there was a point to setting it there, after all, and Elsie sat on a crate between them because there were only 2 chairs. and she was small enough that the crate worked. Elias fixed the roof before the next storm came. He had been putting it off because roof work in winter was miserable and he was the only one to do it, and the leak was manageable if he kept a bucket in the right spot. The bucket was in a spot that would be inconvenient now that there were 3 people in the cabin, and Clara had made a small sound, the first time she'd seen it, that was not a complaint exactly, but communicated something. And so he went up on the roof in the cold and found the source of the problem, which was worse than he'd thought, and spent 4 hours fixing it in a way that would hold through spring. He came down stiff and cold to find that Clara had built a crib for Elsie out of 2 crates and a piece of canvas stretched between them, padded with the extra blankets and positioned near enough to the fire to be warm, but far enough not to be a hazard. She had also, apparently, assessed the state of his cold storage situation and reorganized it in a way he did not entirely understand, but which she explained with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has thought about food storage in winter in a way that a man living alone usually doesn't. "You were letting the cold air get to the salted meat," she said. "Drying it out faster than it should. It's lasted fine. It would last longer." He looked at the reorganized storage. "How do you know about salted meat?" She paused. "My husband's family ran a butchering operation." Before she stopped, "I learned some things." He didn't push it. She had mentioned her husband 3 times in the days since the fever, each time the way you mention a bruise you're trying not to press, brief and careful and moving past it. He understood, in the general way, what the situation was. Husband dead, debt left behind, no family willing to take in a widow with a child. A decision made in some combination of desperation and practicality to answer an advertisement in a Western paper. He did not understand, did not yet ask, what kind of man the husband had been, or what the debt was, or why the family had turned away rather than helped. He would ask, but not yet. The townspeople had a faster timeline for these things than Elias did. He went into Redemption Bluff on the 10th day, when the storm had eased enough to make the road passable, to pick up supplies and speak to the feed supplier about his delayed order. He was in Harlan's storehouse for 20 minutes. In that time, he learned from Harlan, who had learned from the postmaster's wife, who had apparently learned from anyone willing to listen, that Elias Crow had taken a mail-order bride into his cabin, and that the bride had arrived with another man's child, and that the exact details of the situation were unclear, but growing more colorful with each telling. Harlan delivered this information with the carefully neutral tone of a man who is not passing judgment, but is absolutely passing information. "People are talking," he said. "That's all I'm saying." "People are usually talking," Elias said. "About you specifically is what I mean." "I heard you." He loaded his supplies and drove home. He didn't tell Clara what Harlan had said, partly because it would serve no useful purpose, and partly because he was not entirely sure what Clara's reaction would be, and he was not ready to manage it on top of everything else. He told himself this was practical. It was partly practical. What he didn't tell her, because he was still sitting with it himself, was the other thing Harlan had mentioned. The offhand comment delivered almost as an afterthought, in the way of things that are actually the whole point, that Silas Vane had been in the bank asking about Elias's deed. Not about the debt specifically, but about the deed. The instrument of ownership, who held it, what the conditions were, whether there were any technical irregularities in the filing. Elias had filed that deed 6 years ago when he bought the original 60 acres. He had done it himself in the county seat, with a lawyer who cost him 2 days' wages and whom he had never seen again. He had no reason to think there was anything wrong with it. He also knew that Silas Vane did not look at things without a reason. He said nothing to Clara. He watched Elsie sit in the middle of the floor and build a structure out of 2 pieces of firewood and a tin cup and narrate the process to herself in a running monologue that mixed real words with sounds that were not yet words. And he thought about the deed and the debt and Vane's particular way of looking at things. And he felt the specific unease of a man who knows something is coming and cannot yet see its shape. Elsie finished her structure, regarded it for a moment, and knocked it over with one deliberate swipe of her hand. Then she looked up at Elias, as if for confirmation that this was the correct outcome. "Good work," he said. She seemed satisfied with this assessment and began rebuilding. By the second week, the cabin had become something neither of them had planned, and both of them were navigating with the careful attention of people who know they are on uncertain ground. Clara repaired the damage to her dresses that the journey had done, and mended 2 of Elias's shirts with stitching that was noticeably neater than the patches he'd put on them himself. She established a system for the laundry and the cooking, and the management of what they had, and she did it without ceremony or announcement, which was how she appeared to do most things. Elias built a shelf. He had been meaning to build it for 2 years and hadn't, because there was no one but himself who needed the storage, and he could make do. Now Clara's few possessions, the things she had brought from Boston in the battered trunk, that had somehow made it through the journey, needed somewhere to live, and making do was no longer a reasonable answer. He built it in an afternoon from lumber he had stacked in the barn, and it was not elegant, but it was solid, and Clara ran her hand along the edge of it, with the expression of someone appreciating workmanship, without making it into a speech. She put her things on it: a small box, 2 books, a tin that he did not ask about, the few items that had made the cut when she was deciding what to carry west. He saw what was in the tin. Once by accident the lid was off, and he passed by at the wrong angle. It held a small photograph and a folded piece of paper. He did not look closely. He moved on. The image stayed with him. A woman who had carried across 1,000 miles of winter only the smallest evidence that she had existed somewhere else, and had organized even that with the same precision she organized everything. He did not ask about the tin, not yet. What broke the silence between them on the topic of her past was not a careful conversation. It was Elsie. Elsie had been playing near the hearth on a Sunday afternoon while Clara mended, and Elias read a habit he had maintained through the worst years, because books cost nothing once you had them, and they were one of the few things in his life that had never let him down. Elsie stood up, walked to where Elias was sitting, and climbed up onto the chair beside him with the confident entitlement of a child who has decided that something is available to her, and that this is simply the case now. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. She pointed at the book. Story, she said. He looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him with an expression that was carefully not an expression, the particular blankness of a mother, waiting to see how a stranger will respond to her child. Elias looked at the book, which was a history of frontier land management, and contained no stories at all in any meaningful sense. Then he closed it and said, "What kind of story?" Elsie considered this question with great seriousness. "Dog," she said finally. "A story about a dog." "Dog," she confirmed, settling herself against his arm in the manner of someone who has found the correct place and is not planning to leave it. Elias made up a story about a dog. It was not a good story by any literary measure, but it had a dog in it, and the dog got into trouble and got out of it again. And Elsie listened with the full, concentrated attention of a child who is hearing exactly what she asked for. Partway through, Clara put down her mending and listened too, and didn't seem to realize she was doing it. When the story ended, Elsie said more. "Tomorrow," he said. She accepted this with the solemnity of a contract. That night after Elsie was asleep, Clara came and sat at the table where Elias was doing figures, the ongoing mathematics of survival that never fully left him alone, and she put her hands flat on the table and said, "His name was Daniel Whitmore." He set down his pencil. "He was a bookkeeper," she said. "He was not a bad man. He made mistakes. He borrowed money that he couldn't pay back, and he didn't tell me until after he was sick. And even then, he didn't tell me all of it." She was looking at her hands. "He died in June. His creditors came in August. His family, his mother and brothers. They decided the debt was mine to manage. They took what they could from the house, and they told me I should find a way." A way, Elias said, to handle it, to go somewhere. Not be their problem. She said it without bitterness, which was worse than if she'd said it with bitterness, because the absence of bitterness meant she had already processed past it into something quieter and more settled. "I had Elsie and $70 and a room in a boarding house that I could pay for until December. So you answered my advertisement." "I answered 4 advertisements. Yours was the only one that wrote back twice." She paused. "The second letter was better than the first. The first sounded careful. The second sounded honest. You told me the ranch was struggling and that you couldn't promise much. Most men lie about that." He thought about the 2 letters he'd written, in this same cabin, at this same table, trying to figure out what to say about himself and his circumstances that was accurate without being discouraging. He had not thought about the distinction she was drawing between them. "I wasn't trying to be honest. I was trying to decide what to leave out." "That's usually what honesty is," Clara said. He looked at her. She met the look with that steady quality she had, not challenging, not performing steadiness, just actually steady. "I'm not asking you to forgive any of it," she said. "The situation you're in, with me and Elsie here, I know what it costs. I know you have almost nothing. I know I came with almost less." She straightened slightly. "I'm asking you to let us be useful. We can be useful." "You already are. I mean going forward the whole winter." She paused. "And whatever comes after." "Whatever comes after" was a large phrase that covered a lot of territory, and they both understood that and left it unclaimed, because there were limits to what 2 people who had known each other for 10 days could responsibly mean by it. Elias picked up his pencil. The roof will last the winter, he said. The food stores are tight but manageable. I have a debt with the bank that needs to be serviced in March. That's the thing I don't have an answer for yet. How much? He told her the number. He had not told another person this number in 2 years, because it was the kind of number that changes how people look at you, and he didn't need to see that in anyone's eyes. Clara did not change her expression. She looked at the number in her mind the way she looked at the cold storage problem, practically from the side, looking for the angle. What does the bank want? She asked. Your land? I think so, but they'd have to call the debt to get it, and they haven't yet. He paused. There's a man named Vane. He runs the bank. He's been asking about my deed. Why? I don't know yet. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then we need to know. Not you, Elias noticed it. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the night was very still and very cold. The kind of cold that is almost a presence you become aware of it at the edges of warmth, the place where the fire's reach ends. The cabin held it off, as it always had, and Elsie slept behind them, without knowing about any of it, and the two adults sat at the table with the arithmetic of their situation between them, and began slowly, without naming it as such, to work on it together. That was the beginning. Not of the good things, those would take time, and several of them would only become visible in retrospect, as most good things do. The beginning of the working arrangement, that was actually a different kind of arrangement than either of them, was ready to call by its right name. The beginning of two people who had come to the same rough patch of land, from different directions and different disasters, and were carefully and without excessive optimism, starting to build something in the middle of a Dakota winter with whatever was at hand. What was at hand was not much: 10 acres, a patched roof, tight food stores, a debt with a deadline, a banker who was asking questions that had no good answer, and 3 people who had not planned to be in the same room together and were discovering, one day at a time, that planning had nothing to do with it. In the bank at the center of Redemption Bluff, Silas Vane was not a patient man, but he was a methodical one, and he had learned long ago that the difference between patience and method was that method got things done. He looked at the deed records. He had persuaded the county clerk to let him review, persuaded in the particular way that men with money persuade people who need money, which is the oldest persuasion there is. He looked at the survey lines. He looked at the railroad company's preliminary route map, which he had obtained at considerable expense from a contact in the territorial capital. Elias Crow's 10 acres sat on the route like a stone in a road. Vane picked up his pen. He had been waiting for the right moment to apply pressure, and the right moment, he had decided, had arrived. Struggling rancher was manageable. A struggling rancher with a woman and a child, a woman with no family, no standing, no legal claim to the property she was living on, was considerably more manageable. He began to write. Vane's letter arrived on a Tuesday. Elias recognized the envelope before he opened it, the bank's seal pressed into the wax, the particular weight of paper that costs more than paper needs to cost, kind of correspondence that announces itself as serious before you've read a word of it. He had ridden into town for supplies and collected it from Potts at the station, who handed it over with the expression of a man who knows what's inside and is glad it isn't addressed to him. Elias did not open it until he was back on the road, a mile from town, where there was no one to watch his face. He read it twice. Then he folded it, put it in his coat pocket, and drove the rest of the way home without stopping. Clara was at the table when he came in, working through a pile of mending that had accumulated over the past 2 weeks, his things and Elsie's things and a few items belonging to herself that had suffered in the journey west and were being systematically addressed. She looked up when he came through the door and read something in his posture before he'd taken his coat off, because she had that quality, the alertness of someone who had learned to notice things before they were announced. "What happened?" she asked. He put the letter on the table in front of her. She read it. He watched her face while she read, not because he was trying to. It was simply that her face was what was in front of him, and he was too tired from the ride and from the particular exhaustion of dread to look somewhere else. She read it through once quickly, and then again slowly, which was also how he'd read it. And when she set it down, her expression was composed in the careful way of someone who has decided composure is the appropriate response and is implementing it consciously. 7 days, she said. That's what it says. The letter was not imprecise. Vane had written it himself. Elias could tell from the handwriting, which was the handwriting of a man who had learned penmanship as a demonstration of authority, and used it that way. And it said, in the civilized language of legal threat, the bank had reviewed Elias Crow's outstanding debt and had determined that the terms of the original loan agreement had been materially altered by the change in household circumstances, specifically the addition of dependents not accounted for in the original collateral assessment, and that the bank therefore required either full settlement of the outstanding balance within 7 days or the immediate vacancy of the property pending foreclosure proceedings. Full settlement, a number that Elias did not have and could not get in 7 days or 70. He's using us as the reason, Clara said. She was not asking. Elsie and me. He's saying we changed the terms. That's what the language means. Can he do that legally? Elias was quiet for a moment. I don't know. Probably not, on the face of it. But legality and what a man with a bank can actually do to you aren't always the same thing. He sat down across from her. Even if I fight it, fighting it costs money. Time. He knows I don't have either. Clara looked at the letter again. Something moved in her expression, not fear exactly. More like recognition. The look of someone who has encountered a specific kind of bad faith before and is finding it familiar. He wants the land, she said. He wants the railroad route. My land is in the way. She absorbed this. When did you find out about the railroad? I suspected it. Harlan mentioned Vane had been asking about my deed a few weeks ago. I looked at the county maps when I was in town last week. He paused. The preliminary route runs through the middle of my south pasture. You didn't tell me. I didn't know enough to tell you anything useful. It was true, but it was also the kind of true that has other things underneath it. And Clara understood that from the way her eyes held on his for a moment before she moved on. She was getting to know the shape of how he communicated, what he said directly, and what he left adjacent to the saying available if you were paying attention. What are the options? She asked. He laid them out the way he'd been laying them out in his head for the past hour on the road. He could try to find a lawyer, which required money and time, neither of which he had. He could try to sell a portion of the land to pay the debt, but no one in Redemption Bluff would buy a parcel that Vane wanted, and Vane would block any sale that didn't go through him. He could try to appeal to the Territorial Land Office, but that process moved on a timeline measured in months, not days. He could call Vane's bluff, simply not respond, stay on the land, and force Vane to actually execute the foreclosure, which would take time and exposure. Elias said, I do what he's asking. Clara went very still. Send you and Elsie away, he said. He doesn't actually want to foreclose. He wants the land clear of complications so he can make an offer I can't refuse. If I demonstrate I'm manageable, he'll give me a way to settle the debt that serves his purposes. He said it without inflection, just laying out the logic. He gets the land. I get clear of the debt. You and Elsie stop. We go back to nothing, Clara said, or somewhere equivalent. I'm not saying I'm going to do it. Then why are you saying it? Because you deserve to know all of it, including the parts where the arithmetic is ugly. Clara stood up. She walked to the window. There was one window in the main room, small and south-facing, and in the winter light, it showed the pale flat of the yard and the barn beyond it, and the land stretching out in the particular empty way of the frontier, which is beautiful if you're not desperate and simply large if you are. She stood there with her back to him, and he could see her working through something, the set of her shoulders doing the work that her face wasn't showing him. How much does he know about me, she asked. About my situation. Enough to write that letter. Someone talked. Potts, she said. Or the woman from the dry goods store. She asked me questions when I went in last week. Thought she was being friendly. Elias had not known. Clara had gone to the dry goods store. She had gone while he was handling the animals, apparently, and come back with a few small things she'd purchased, with money, from somewhere in her own stores. She had some small amount she hadn't mentioned, and he hadn't asked about. The information arrived now as a small piece of something larger. What kind of questions, he asked. My history, my husband. How I came to be here. She turned from the window. Whether you and I were actually married. What did you tell her? The truth, that we had an arrangement, she paused. She smiled in a particular way. I knew what the smile meant. I've seen it before. He had seen it too in Harlan's face, in the faces of people he passed in town. The frontier was not a place of particular sophistication about women who arrived under ambiguous circumstances. It had its own moral arithmetic, and it was not always wrong, but it was often applied with the precision of a sledgehammer. Vane is going to use it, Elias said. Of course he is. She came back to the table and stood beside it rather than sitting, her hands resting on the back of the chair. He's going to tell people I manipulated you, that you were deceived into taking in a woman of questionable character with a child that isn't yours. That your judgment was compromised. She said it without apparent emotion. It's what I would do if I were him, and I wanted to destroy someone's reputation efficiently. Your reputation, Elias said, and by extension yours. A man who can be fooled by a pretty widow isn't a man whose land dealings can be trusted. She looked at him steadily. He doesn't need to prove anything. He just needs enough people to have enough doubt that when he moves on the land, No one makes trouble for him. Elias sat with this. It was a clear-eyed assessment, delivered without self-pity, and that accuracy was part of what made it hard to hear the way the truth sometimes lands harder when it comes without cushioning. That's what he said then. Elias said, half to himself. When he came to the post office, when he had the letter intercepted, he wasn't just delaying you, he was making sure you arrived without anyone meeting you. So the situation looked as bad as possible from the start. Clara's eyes moved. Something shifted in them. He knew I was coming. He had access to the mail before I did. He knew what I'd advertised. He knew a woman was answering. He paused. I think he let you arrive in that storm on purpose. The room was very quiet after he said it. Outside, the wind made its habitual commentary against the cabin walls, not the violence of the blizzard they'd survived, but the constant low-grade pressure of a Dakota winter, which was its own kind of persistence. Clara sat down slowly. She set her hands flat on the table and looked at them. He let us nearly freeze, she said. I think he hoped it would solve the problem cleanly. A woman who arrived and didn't survive the first night, or who was ill enough that she'd turn around and go back, that's a much simpler situation than whatever this is. Whatever this is. He used his own phrasing from weeks ago, and heard it differently now, in this new light. They were not an arrangement any more than a house was just a pile of lumber. They had become something that Vane had not counted on, something that had its own weight and its own roots, shallow as they were, that did not pull up easily. We need to know who else he's talked to, Clara said. Her voice had shifted not harder, exactly, but more purposeful, like a tool picked up and examined and found to be the right one. And who he hasn't. Why? Because people who haven't heard his version yet are still capable of forming their own opinion. She looked up. Who in this town knew you before all of this? Who has reason to think well of you? Elias thought about it honestly. 3 years of shrinking financially, socially had narrowed his circle in ways he hadn't fully acknowledged. He had neighbors who were cordial and not much more. He had Harlan, who was fair but transactional. He had Dr. Everett Hale, who had treated his horses twice and his own arm once, and who was one of the oldest men in the valley, and one of the few people Vane could not directly intimidate through financial leverage. Hale, he said, the doctor. He has his own land outright. No debt to the bank. Vane can't lean on him the way he leans on everyone else. Clara nodded slowly. Would he listen? He listens to everything. Whether he acts on it is different. Then we start there. She stood again. She thought better on her feet. He had noticed. The same way some people thought better while writing. And we need to move before Vane does. He gave us 7 days, because he thinks that's enough time for us to panic. We need to use the time differently. Elias looked at her. He had the distinct sensation, not unpleasant, of watching someone step into a role they had been shaped for, without knowing it, the particular quality of a person who understands how situations work and what they require, and is able to set their own fear aside long enough to be useful. He had not expected it. He was not sure why he had not expected it, given everything she had shown him in the past 3 weeks, but he had not. What are you thinking? He asked. I'm thinking that Vane has been operating on the assumption that I'm a liability. She said it plainly. I think we should let him keep thinking that for another few days. Think I should go into town? Absolutely not. Elias, he's building a case against you. Every time you're visible in that town, he adds to it. Every time I'm invisible, he adds to it faster. She met his objection head on, not impatiently, but with the firmness of someone who has already thought past the objection to where it goes. A woman who hides looks guilty. A woman who goes to town, who talks to people, who asks about sick children and brings soup when someone's ill, that woman is harder to paint as a schemer. She paused. I know how this works. I watched my husband's family do it to me. The answer to being talked about is not to disappear. The answer is to make the story harder to tell. The room was quiet again. Elsie was sleeping in the back, had been sleeping since before Elias got home, her afternoon nap running long in the way of children, who have no concept of inconvenient timing. The fire moved in the hearth. Elias thought about what Clara was proposing. It was not a plan so much as a posture, a way of being in the world that refused the role being assigned. He understood the logic. He was not certain the frontier would respond to that logic the way she believed it would, because the frontier was not Boston, and the social mechanics were different in ways she might not yet understand. But she had gotten herself and a 2-year-old child across half a continent on $70 in the middle of winter. He was not going to be the person who told her she didn't understand how things worked. Fine, he said, but not alone. She looked at him. If you go, we go together. He said it like it wasn't a significant thing. Easier to explain the situation when we're both present. She held his gaze for a moment. All right. They went to town the next morning. It was not a dramatic entrance. They arrived in the wagon, parked it outside the dry goods store, and went about the ordinary business of purchasing what they needed. Clara carried Elsie on her hip and spoke to the owner, a woman named Bess Trotter, who had the sharp eyes of someone who had spent 40 years monitoring the social temperature of a small community and had not missed much. Clara was direct without being aggressive, answering the questions that Bess asked, and a few that she didn't ask but was clearly forming, and doing it in the calm, factual way of a person who has decided that their story belongs to them and no one else. Elias watched from near the door, pretending to look at a display of hardware he had no intention of purchasing. Bess asked about Elsie, Clara answered. Bess asked with the delicacy of someone stepping onto uncertain ice, about the nature of Clara and Elias's arrangement. Clara said, without embarrassment, "We came to each other honestly. Told him I had a daughter. He wrote back anyway. We're making something of it, which is more than most people expected of either of us." She shifted Elsie to her other hip. "I imagine some people have said otherwise." Bess's eyes moved to Elias and back. "There's been some talk, I know," Clara said. "I also know that Mr. Vane has been speaking to people about our situation. I know what he's been saying. I don't have the standing to argue with a banker, Mrs. Trotter. All I can do is let people see for themselves." Bess was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My youngest had a croup last week. Nearly sent my husband for the doctor." "Croup in winter is frightening," Clara said. "How is she now?" "Better. Still coughing. A poultice of mustard and lard on the chest helps at night. Keep her upright. If she wakes coughing, don't lay her flat." She said it the way she said most things, not showing off, just knowing. "I can bring some of the mustard compound if it would help. I make it for Elsie when the weather turns." Bess Trotter looked at Clara with an expression that had shifted, slightly but perceptibly, from the careful neutrality she'd maintained at the start of the conversation. "That would be kind," she said. It was not a victory. One woman's softened opinion in a dry goods store was not a battle won against a banker with a 7-day ultimatum and a railroad map. Elias understood this, but he also understood that battles like this one were not won. All at once they were won or lost in the accumulation of small moments, and this was a small moment that had gone right. Dr. Hale was at his house when they called, which was a converted room off the back of his residence that he used as an examination room and office. He was 67 years old, thin, white-bearded, with the careful movements of someone who has learned to preserve energy, but the eyes of someone who has not lost a single step mentally and would like you to know it. He looked at Clara with the direct assessment of a man who had been looking at people medically for 40 years, and Sesson had stopped making social distinctions about who was worth his full attention. "Crow Ranch," he said. "I heard you'd arrived." "Most people have," Clara said. Something moved in his face, appreciation perhaps for directness. "Sit down, both of you." He gestured at 2 chairs and a third that he pulled from behind his desk. "Tell me what's actually happening," Elias told him. He told him about the letter, about the 7-day ultimatum, about what he understood of Vane's interest in the railroad route. He told him what he suspected about the intercepted mail. He told him as plainly as he could, without embellishment, because Hale was the kind of man who responded to plain speech and dismissed theater. Hale listened without interrupting. He sat with his hands folded on his desk, and his eyes moving between them as they spoke. And when Elias finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Vane's been doing this for 3 years, Hale said finally. "Picking off properties he needs one at a time. Your neighbor Alderman lost his North 40 last spring. You know the circumstances? I heard it was debt. It was debt that Vane manufactured by delaying Alderman's loan renewal until the interest had compounded past what Alderman could manage. Perfectly legal, technically. Perfectly monstrous, practically." He looked at Clara. "And you're the lever he's found for Elias?" "Yes," Clara said. "He's positioned me as the reason the debt needs to be called. The disruption to the household. The unknown quantity. Unknown quantities make people nervous." Hale leaned back. "He'll have told people something, not lies, necessarily. Just the most damaging version of the truth. A widow from the East. A child of another man. An arrangement of unclear legality." "We're not married," Clara said. Not yet," Hale repeated and looked at Elias. Elias said nothing. He was aware of the 2 words and their weight, and chose at that moment to let them sit there without responding to them, because responding would make them into more of a statement than he was ready to make. Hale noticed this. He had been noticing things for 67 years and was not going to stop now. "All right," he said. "What do you need from me?" "We need to know who Vane has already spoken to," Elias said. "And we need someone in this town who can speak to my character when the time comes. If it comes to that." "Come to that." Hale said it without drama. "Vane won't let this resolve quietly. He'll make it public because public pressure is cheaper than legal action." He paused. "I can speak to your character. I can speak to yours as well," he added to Clara. "Though we've only just met, and I'll say so honestly. But an honest statement carries more weight than a rehearsed one in my experience. Who else? Clara asked. Hale thought Martha Doyle. She runs the lending library in the women's circle and half the informal communication in this valley. Vane stays clear of her because she's old enough and established enough that leaning on her would cost him more than it gains. He looked at Clara. She'll want to meet you herself. She won't take my word for it. When? Soon as you can manage. He stood, which was his way of ending a meeting. Elias. Don't answer the letter. Don't give him the satisfaction of a response that shows you're frightened. What do I give him instead? Hale looked at him with the dry precision of a man who has watched a great deal of human behavior and retained his opinions about it. Time, you have 7 days. Use all 7. They drove home in the mid-afternoon, the light already going thin and gold the way it did in winter, and Elsie fell asleep between them on the wagon seat, which was not a comfortable position for anyone involved, but which she maintained with the commitment of someone who has found a suitable spot and will not be relocated. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the road, and Elias drove, and for a while neither of them spoke. You said not yet, Clara said finally. He kept his eyes on the road. I know what I said. I'm not asking you to mean it as a proposal. She said it carefully. I'm asking if you said it because it was the practical answer in that moment, or because you meant it as something more than that. Elias thought about how to answer. He thought about it longer than was comfortable, not because he didn't know, but because he was trying to find language for something that had been living without language in him for some time now. The frontier was not a place that rewarded articulation of feeling. You survived, you worked. If things went well, you were less alone. The language for the space between surviving together and meaning something to each other, that language was not one he had practiced. I meant it, he said, as something more than practical. Clara was quiet. But I know what you came out here for, he said, and I know what you've been managing. And I don't want you to feel like the situation is asking you to decide something before you're ready to. That's a very careful way of saying something. I'm a careful person. I know. She shifted Elsie slightly, adjusting the child's weight. I think I'm going to meet Martha Doyle, she said, which was not a response to what he'd said, and was also completely a response to what he'd said. All right, he said. Elsie made a sound in her sleep that was not quite a word and not quite not. Martha Doyle's house was the most organized place Elias had ever been inside, which was saying something because Elias was organized in the way that people who have very few things are organized by necessity. But Martha's organization was different. It was the organization of a woman who had inhabited a space for decades and had refined it through continuous small corrections into an expression of exactly who she was. Bookshelves that held books that had been read, chairs that were positioned for conversation, not decoration. A fire that was tended to a specific temperature, not just kept alive. Martha herself was somewhere in her mid-70s, small and compact, with white hair pulled back, and eyes that had the quality of seeing more than they appeared to be looking at. She received them 3 days after Hale's visit, which was 2 days before Vane's deadline, which was a timeline that had been sitting on Elias's chest like a stone. She looked at Clara for a long moment when they came in. Not rudely, just fully, the way you look at something you intend to understand. You're the one Vane's been talking about, she said. Yes, ma'am, Clara said. What's he been saying? That I deceived Elias, that I'm a woman of uncertain character using a child to gain sympathy and access to property I have no right to. Martha nodded slowly. That's essentially what I heard. How much of it is true? None of the characterization. Some of the facts. Clara sat down without being asked, which was either rudeness or confidence, and Martha's expression suggested she was noting which. I'm a widow. I came west by advertisement. I have a daughter who isn't Elias's. I'm not legally his wife. All of that is accurate. She paused. The part about deception is not Elias. Martha looked at him. Do you feel deceived? No. Did you know about the child before she arrived? I knew she had a daughter. I knew her husband had died. And the debt? Hers and yours? My debt is mine and has nothing to do with her arrival. He said it flatly. He's using her as the reason to call the debt, because the real reason is the railroad. Martha looked at him for a moment, then at Clara, then at Elsie, who was sitting on the floor examining a small carved wooden horse that Martha had placed there, without explanation, when they arrived, which suggested she had been expecting a child and had prepared for one. The Alderman property, Martha said. Yes, Elias said. The Brecker property the spring before that, and the Hollis family in '88. She said the names like she'd been saying them in her head for a while. I've been watching him do this. The difference is that those men were alone when he came for them. She looked at Clara again. You're not alone, Clara held her gaze. Not anymore. No. Martha folded her hands in her lap. He thinks you're the weakness. He usually picks the thing a man cares most about and applies pressure there. She paused. Question is whether he's miscalculated, has he? Elias asked. Martha considered. I've been in this valley for 31 years. I've watched people come and go. I've watched men like Vane operate, and there have always been men like Vane, and I've watched communities either let it happen or not. She looked at the fire. What he's never understood is that the frontier runs as on reputation and reciprocity. You help when help is needed, and people remember. You don't, and they remember that too. She turned back to Clara. Have you been helping? Where I could, Clara said. Trotter's daughter with the croup. The alderman woman, when her husband's horse threw him, and he was laid up, I brought food twice. Martha's eyebrows moved slightly. You went to the alderman place? She looked tired when I saw her at the store. She had 3 children and a husband who couldn't work. Clara said it without drama. It wasn't a calculated thing. She just looked tired. Martha was quiet for a moment. Something had shifted in her expression, not surprise exactly. More like a hypothesis being confirmed. All right, she said. Here is what we're going to do. What Martha proposed was not complicated in concept and was very complicated in execution. She would call together the women's circle, which was not a sewing club, as Vane dismissively believed, but a network of the wives and mothers who managed the actual daily operations of most of the households and ranches in the valley, and who communicated with each other with a speed and accuracy that would have impressed a telegraph operator. She would tell them what Vane was doing. She would let them see Clara. Not perform, Martha said, looking at Clara directly. Not put on a face or make a speech, just be who you are in a room full of people who are making up their minds. I'm not a performer, Clara said. I know, that's why I'm suggesting it. Elias drove home that evening with the particular feeling of a man who has set something in motion and is not fully certain what it will produce. Clara sat beside him in the gathering dark, Elsie asleep again between them, and the road was clear and cold and very quiet. She's something, Clara said. She's been this valley's conscience for 30 years, Elias said. Vane avoids her because he can't buy her, and he can't frighten her, and he's smart enough to know that attacking her directly would cost him more than whatever he gained. She reminded me of my mother, Clara said. Then after a pause, my mother died when I was 12. She had that quality of looking at you and deciding whether you were worth her time. Did she decide? She did, Clara said. He didn't ask which way. He didn't need to. On the 6th day, the day before the deadline, Vane made his move in the open. He went to the saloon, which he rarely did, because Vane was not a man who drank with other men. As a rule, drinking was social leveling, and Vane had no interest in being level with anyone. But he went on the 6th day, and he sat at a table, and he said things quietly and precisely, in the way of a man who knows how information travels and has aimed it carefully. He said that a poor rancher, half mad from isolation, had been taken in by a woman with a history of debt and manipulation. He said that the child was the evidence. A woman who couldn't manage her own household was being given management of another man's land. He said it was a shame, really. He said he hoped Crow would come to his senses. He said it where 3 men who were neither his friends nor Elias's friends could hear it clearly. Men who would repeat it. Elias heard about it from Harlan the next morning, the morning of the 7th day, before he'd finished hitching the horses. Stood in the barn with his hand on the harness, and felt the anger move through him in the particular way that anger does, when it's been building for weeks and finally has a specific shape to point itself at. Not rage, something colder and more useful than rage. The clarity of a person who has been patient long enough and is done being patient. He went inside. Clara was at the table. She had Elsie beside her, and she was reading to the child from one of her 2 books, a picture book, that Elsie has discovered on the shelf and claimed as her own personal property, a status Clara had apparently acknowledged. She looked up when Elias came in. He told her what Vane had said. He told her plainly and quickly, the way she always told him things. Clara set the book down. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Elias. He did it the day before the deadline, she said. On purpose. Yes. So that we would hear it this morning and spend today frightened. She said it analytically. Not angrily the way you describe the mechanics of a trap you've identified. So that when we ride in, if we ride in, we look reactive, defensive, or we don't ride in and he has the property by default. We're riding in, she said. I know. She closed the book and handed it to Elsie, who accepted it with the solemnity of someone receiving a formal responsibility. Then Clara stood, smoothed her dress, and looked at Elias with the expression he had come to recognize as her operational face, not hard, not cold, but stripped of everything non-essential. Does Elsie have anyone who can watch her? She asked. Harlan's wife, she's offered before. Then we leave Elsie with her. She paused. I don't want Elsie in town for this, agreed Elias. She held his eyes. When we walk into that bank, I need you to let me speak first." He looked at her. He thought about the 7 days they'd just lived through, and the 3 weeks before that, and the woman standing across from him, who had managed a frontier winter, and a sick child, and a threat, and a dead husband's debt, and had done all of it without falling apart, without asking for more than what was necessary, without pretending the situation was something other than what it was. Outside, the 7th day had started gray and was getting grayer. The temperature had dropped overnight in the indifferent way of Dakota winters, which did not moderate their behavior based on whether you were having a crisis. The road to Redemption Bluff was hard and clear. They hitched the horses. They dropped Elsie at Harlan's house. Elsie, who woke from her morning drowsiness to find herself in a new house, with a woman who immediately offered her biscuits, and who therefore became, in Elsie's comprehensive moral universe, unambiguously good. They drove the 8 miles to town. Elias kept his hands on the reins and his eyes on the road. Clara sat straight beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her face forward. They did not speak for the first 6 miles. Then Clara said quietly, almost to herself, "He let us nearly freeze to death. He intercepted your mail. He's spent 6 weeks telling this town who I am." She paused. "He's been very confident that this would go the way he planned." Elias said nothing. "I need him to keep being confident," she said. "Just a little longer." He looked at her then briefly. She was looking at the road. "How long?" he asked. "Till we're inside." The bank appeared at the end of the main street, solid and square and deliberate, the way Vane built everything to communicate permanence and authority, to make you feel smaller as you approached. Elias tied the horses at the post. He came around and offered Clara his hand down from the wagon, which was a practical gesture, and also, in the cold, clear morning on the main street of Redemption Bluff, with people watching from shop windows and doorways, something more than practical. She took his hand. She stepped down. She did not look at the watching windows. They walked toward the bank together, and behind them on the street, something held its breath. The bank door was heavier than it needed to be. That was the first thing Elias always noticed when he came here. The door was solid oak, reinforced with iron hardware, built to a weight that required deliberate effort to open. It was not a functional necessity. It was a statement. You entered Vane's bank by acknowledging physically that entry required something from you. Elias pulled it open and held it for Clara, who walked through without hesitation, and he followed, and the door swung shut behind them with the particular finality of a well-made thing closing. The interior was dim and warm, heated by a cast iron stove in the corner that Vane kept at a temperature that suggested abundance. The teller's window was to the left, staffed by a young man named Croft, who had the permanent expression of someone performing composure. Beyond the teller's window, through a doorway that was open but implied it could be closed at any time, was Vane's office. Vane was standing in the doorway. He had positioned himself there. Elias understood immediately, not sitting behind his desk, which would have required them to approach him, but standing in the threshold, where he could see them the moment they entered, and they would see him, seeing them. He was a large man, mid-50s, with the kind of physical presence that comes not from labor, but from decades of being the person in the room who decides things. His suit was good, his watch chain was visible. He looked at them both with an expression of polite attention that had been calibrated to communicate, very precisely, that their arrival was expected and unsurprising, and that he had already decided how this conversation would end. "Mr. Crow," he said. His eyes moved to Clara and Mrs. "Whitmore, is it?" "It is," Clara said. He gestured toward the chairs arranged in front of his desk, the way you gesture toward chairs you own, in a room you own. "Come in." They came in. Clara sat. Elias remained standing, which was not something he had planned. It was simply what his body decided to do. Some calculation made below conscious thought that said standing was the correct response to this room and this man. Vane noticed it and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of response. Vane sat behind his desk. He picked up a paper from the stack in front of him and held it in a way that communicated it was important without requiring him to say so. "I appreciate you coming in person. It saves correspondence." He looked at the paper. "You received my letter 7 days ago," Elias said. Pause. "I want you to know that this isn't personal, Elias. I've known you for what is it now? 6 years? I have a great deal of respect for what you've tried to build out on that land. It's been a difficult few years for everyone." Elias said nothing. He had learned, in 3 years of difficult conversations with difficult men, that saying nothing was sometimes the most accurate response to a lie told with a sympathetic face. Vane let the silence sit for a moment, then glanced at Clara. "I imagine you've been told something about my concerns, about the nature of the situation." "I've been told the letter said I changed the terms of a loan," Clara said. She said it without agitation, without apology, with the mild clarity of someone double-checking a fact. I'd like to understand how. Vane regarded her. He had the particular look of a man reassessing something he had already classified, a quick recalibration nearly invisible. Collateral assessment for Mr. Crow's loan was based on a single-occupant household. The addition of dependents changes the financial exposure of the property. In what way specifically? Additional maintenance costs, additional consumption of resources, the potential for complications that a single man managing his own affairs wouldn't face. Clara folded her hands in her lap. So the bank's position is that a woman who cooks, sews, manages a household, helps with ranch operations, and costs Mr. Crow no salary represents a financial risk to the property. Vane's expression did not change exactly, but something behind it did. Concern is more broadly about the railroad, Clara said. The room went very quiet. Even Croft, audible through the open doorway moving papers at the teller's window, stopped moving. Vane set down his paper. He looked at Clara with the full attention of a man who has just been required to update his assessment significantly. I beg your pardon, he said. The preliminary survey route for the Territorial Railroad runs through the south pasture of Elias's land. She said it the way she said everything, not as an accusation, as information. You've had the survey maps for at least 4 months. You've been looking at Elias's deed for longer than that. The letter about the loan arrived precisely when you had determined that persuading him to sell willingly was going to be more difficult than simply removing the complication. She paused. We are the complication. Vane was very still as Mr. Vane, Clara said, and her voice was the same steady, not unkind, not performing anything. I grew up watching men like you manage the boundaries of property in ways that were always legal and frequently wrong. My father was one of the men those boundaries moved against. I know this script. I know what comes next in it. And what comes next? Vane said. His voice had changed. The warmth had gone out of it, not all at once, but the way warmth leaves a room gradually, and then completely. You tell us the debt will be called in full. We can't pay it. Property goes to foreclosure. You acquire it through the bank's holding company at a price well below market, which you can do because there's no competing buyer in a market where you control the credit. She looked at him without flinching. Then you sell it to the railroad at a significant profit, which is the entire point. Vane looked at Elias. You've been talking to people. People have been talking to us. Elias said hail. Vane said it like a man placing a chess piece he hadn't accounted for. And Martha Doyle, I imagine. He looked back at Clara. You've been busy. We've been honest, Clara said. People willing to hear it. Vane leaned back in his chair. He was recalculating visibly, without quite hiding it, the way a man recalculates when a situation has developed differently than his model predicted. He was not panicked. He was too experienced to panic. But something had shifted in the room's balance, and he knew it, and they knew he knew it. The debt remains, he said, whatever the reason for calling it. Yes, Elias said, it does. Then we don't have much more to discuss. We have enough. Elias moved for the first time since they'd sat down, not toward Vane, just a shift in weight, a settling. I'm going to tell you what I told Clara 7 days ago when she asked me to think through the options. Can't pay the debt in full today. I won't be able to pay it in full in 7 days. But I'm not going to leave that land. The legal process will take time, Elias said, during which I'll be on the land, during which the people in this town who know what you're doing will have time to make decisions about where they keep their money and who they do business with. He said it flatly, not as a threat, as a consequence, which was different. I'm not asking you for anything, Vane. I'm telling you what's going to happen. You can run the foreclosure process. You'll probably win it eventually. But the cost of winning it is going to be higher than you planned. And I think you know that now. Vane looked at him for a long moment. Get out of my bank, he said. They got out of his bank. The cold air on the street was startling after the heat of the office, a full-body recalibration, like surfacing from water. Elias pulled the door shut behind them and stood on the step for a moment, and Clara stood beside him, and neither of them said anything for the count of several breaths. That went well, Clara said, which was either optimistic or a very dry joke, and he was not entirely sure which. He's not done, Elias said. I know, we told him things he's going to use. We told him things we wanted him to think about. She started toward the wagon. There's a difference. He fell into step beside her. The street had people on it, not a crowd. Just the ordinary population of a small frontier town moving through an ordinary morning. But he was aware of eyes. He was always aware of eyes on the main street of Redemption Bluff, in a way he had not been 3 months ago, before all of this, when he had been invisible in the way that a man alone and struggling is invisible in a community that has quietly written him off. He was not invisible now. They had almost reached the wagon when Martha Doyle appeared at the far end of the street, walking with the deliberate pace of a woman who had somewhere to be and had decided when she would arrive and saw no reason to alter that decision. Behind her, and this was the thing that made Elias stop walking, were people. Not a crowd, not a mob, but enough people to constitute something. He counted without meaning to 6 women, 3 men, 2 of whom he recognized as ranchers from the North Valley, one of whom was Harlan, who was not a man given to public gestures, and whose presence on the street behind Martha Doyle was therefore significant. There were 2 wagons pulled up that had not been there when Elias and Clara arrived, and a cart that belonged to the Alderman family, which he recognized by the specific way the left rear wheel sat. Martha arrived in front of them and stopped. "How did it go?" she asked. "He told us to leave," Elias said, expected. She looked past Emsam at the bank door. "He'll be watching from the window in about 30 seconds. He always watches." "What is this?" Clara asked. She was looking at the people gathered behind Martha, not wary, just trying to understand what she was seeing. "This is Tuesday in Redemption Bluff," Martha said, which explained nothing and somehow everything. "I made some calls. People had already been talking." She paused. "Some of them have things to say. Some of them have things to give." She looked at Clara directly. "Mrs. Doyle, the one from the North Road. Not me, her boy had a chest infection in January. She says you sent broth and a tincture." She seemed worried, Clara said. "She shouldn't have to worry about that alone." "No, she shouldn't." Martha turned slightly. Bess Trotter came forward from the small group. She was carrying something, a cloth bag, the kind used for substantial quantities of provisions. She held it out to Clara with the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is not going to hedge it now. "For the winter stores," she said. "My husband's idea as much as mine, if you're wondering." Clara took the bag. She held it with both hands and looked at Bess Trotter, and something moved in her face that she controlled, but not completely. "Thank you," she said. "Don't," Bess said, not unkindly. "I don't need thanking. I need to be able to sleep at night knowing I did the right thing, which is a purely selfish motivation." She stepped back. One of the ranchers, a man named Pruitt, who Elias had spoken to perhaps twice in 3 years, and with whom he had no particular relationship, came forward and stood in front of Elias. He was a large man with a large mustache, and the hands of someone who had spent 40 years arguing with uncooperative ground. "I heard Vane's been looking at your deed," Pruitt said. I looked at mine. He shook his head slowly. "Told my wife last night that if they come for Crow's place and nobody says anything, we might as well start packing." "I'm not asking anyone to do anything on my account," Issy said. "You're not asking. I'm telling you what I'm doing." Pruitt said it without ceremony. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because I've been watching Vane pick off this valley for 3 years. And I should have said something 2 years ago, and I didn't, and that's a thing I have to live with." He met Elias's eyes. "I'm saying something now." Elias found he had nothing to say to that. He nodded. Harlan materialized from the group in the way Harlan did things, without announcement, without drama, present suddenly where he had not been. He looked at Elias. He looked at Clara. He looked at the bag in Clara's hands. "I added 20 pounds of grain to that," he said, indicating the bag without further explanation. "Don't read too much into it. I just have it to spare this month." "I won't read too much into it," Clara said. "Good." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "Vane's got an account with me for the feed supply. About $800 outstanding." He said this in the tone of a man noting the weather. "I've been thinking about calling that in." Elias looked at him. "Harlan," I said, "I've been thinking about it." He shrugged. A man can think. It was not a general uprising. It was not the whole town. Several people on that street looked at what was happening and went on about their business, and Elias knew that some of them agreed with Vane, or at least found Vane's position less threatening than the alternative. The frontier had always had men like that, people who calculated safety by standing near whoever appeared to be winning, and adjusted their position when the calculation changed. People who had come were enough. They were enough to be visible from the bank window, where Vane was certainly standing right now. Martha had called it to the second, looking at the small assembly on the street and doing his own calculations. Dr. Hale arrived on foot from the direction of his house, unhurried, his coat correctly buttoned, and his hat on straight. He was the kind of man who was never late because he had decided when he would arrive and arrived then. He came to stand beside Martha, looked at Elias and Clara, and then turned to face the bank window, with the air of a man who has a point to make and is making it by standing still. "We're going to be here for a while," he told no one in particular. In case anyone's wondering, what they were collectively was a statement. Not a petition, not a legal argument, not a negotiation. A statement, made in the language of presence, on a cold Tuesday morning on the main street of Redemption Bluff. that the attempt to reduce two people to leverage had not gone unnoticed and was not going to go unanswered. Vane did not come out. He was in there, you could feel it, the weight of a man behind glass making calculations, but he did not come out, and the group stood in the cold for 20 minutes while ordinary town business continued around them and the bank door stayed shut. Then the door opened. Not Vane Croft, the teller, came out carrying a paper. He looked young and uncomfortable and came directly to Elias with the focused attention of someone executing a precise instruction and not deviating from it. "Mr. Vane asks me to give you this," Croft said, holding out the paper. Elias took it. He read it. Then he read it again. It was not a withdrawal of the foreclosure. Vane was not a man who retreated completely. That was not in his nature, and Elias had not expected it. It was a modification. The debt was restructured, reduced payments over a longer period, the full amount still owing, but the schedule extended by 18 months, the immediate demand rescinded. It was not a victory, it was a ceasefire. Elias handed the paper to Clara. She read it, and her expression went through several things quickly: relief, skepticism, the particular caution of someone who has learned that retreating adversaries are not the same as defeated ones. "It's not over," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "But it's not today." "No," he said, "it's not today." Martha appeared at his elbow. She had covered the distance from where she'd been standing with the quiet efficiencies of a woman who had been covering distances for 70-odd years and did not make a production of it. She looked at the paper. "He'll try again," she said. "Different angle. I know. You'll need to be ready for it." "I know that too." She looked at him with the assessing quality she'd had in the meeting at her house, the looks of someone taking a final measurement. "You handled that well," she said. "Both of you." "We mostly just stood there," Elias said. "Yes," Martha said. "Sometimes that's the whole job." She turned to go, then stopped. "The women's circle meets Thursday. Clara, I'd like you there." Clara looked at her. "I'll be there." Martha walked away, and the group began to disperse, and Croft went back inside. And the morning continued, as mornings do, indifferent to the things that have just changed inside them. Elias stood in the street with Clara and felt the cold in a different way than he'd felt it earlier. Earlier, it had been the cold of dread, the thin, persistent cold of a situation that had no good outcome. Now it was just cold, the ordinary temperature of a Dakota winter morning, which was significant but manageable. He took the paper back from Clara and folded it. "We should get Elsie." "Yes." She looked at him. "How are you?" The question surprised him slightly. Not because it was an unreasonable question, but because it was directed at him. And he was not accustomed to being the one asked. "Better than an hour ago." "That's a low bar. It's an honest one." She almost smiled. "We should go get Elsie before she has misses." Harlan convinced that she needs 3 biscuits. She probably already has her convinced. She works fast. They drove to Harlan's house, where Elsie was indeed on her second biscuit and was sitting on Mrs. Harlan's kitchen floor, playing with a set of wooden spoons that Mrs. Harlan had apparently provided, without prompting, demonstrating the deep and immediate understanding experienced women and small children develop with each other. Elsie looked up when Clara and Elias came in and said, "More?" holding out the spoon, which could have been a question about the biscuit or a commentary on the spoon's possibilities as a toy. "We're going home," Clara said. Elsie handed back the wooden spoon with solemnity. She allowed herself to be lifted and settled on Clara's hip, and she looked at Mrs. Harlan with the expression of someone who intends to return. Mrs. Harlan, a stout, practical woman who had apparently decided in the preceding 2 hours that Clara was all right, pressed a wrapped parcel of cornbread into Clara's free hand on the way out and said, "You come back when you need a break," which was not an offer of charity, but of something more neighborly and therefore more valuable. The road home was the same road it always was. The same 8 miles, the same cold, but the wagon felt different on it. Elias wasn't sure how to account for that, the way a physical thing can feel like a different object when the circumstances around it change. Elsie sat between them and ate the last of her biscuit and hummed. Not a song, just a sound, the habitual contentment of a child who is warm and full and in motion, which is most of what a 2-year-old requires of the world. Elias drove. Clara sat with Elsie's weight against her side and her eyes on the horizon, the snow-covered flatness of the valley stretching out ahead of them, and she said, "After a long time, when we get back, I want to make something." "What?" "I don't know yet. Something for the house." She paused. "Something that isn't about surviving." He thought about this, about the difference between the two things, surviving and something else. He had been doing one for 3 years and had, somewhere in the past several weeks, without marking the transition, begun doing the other. "All right," he said. "She made curtains. It sounds small." It was small, materially. She used fabric from the hem of one of her Boston dresses that was beyond repair, a dusty blue cotton that she cut into strips and hemmed and hung across the two windows in the main room. It took an evening. The result was modest by any measure, uneven in places, more serviceable than decorative. Cabin looked different with them. Elias sat in his chair that night and looked at the windows, which now had something in them other than cold glass and the dark outside. And he couldn't have explained what the difference was in any language that would have made sense to another person. Curtains were there. The cabin was the same. Something was different. "You're staring at them," Clara said. She was across the room, putting Elsie to bed with the particular negotiation that preceded it each night. Elsie advancing and retreating on the question of whether sleep was going to happen. "I'm noting them," Elias said. "Is there a difference?" "Staring implies they're unusual. I'm just looking." "You've been looking for 10 minutes. They're good curtains." Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the thing that happens just before one. Elsie, sensing that the adult conversation had become interesting, used the moment to sit up again, which was countered by Clara with the practiced efficiency of someone who has lost this particular battle enough times to have a strategy. That night, after Elsie was definitively asleep, and the fire was banked, and the cabin had settled into the particular quiet of a house that is also a home, that distinction being the whole matter, Elias was still at the table, working on the loan modifications figures, looking at what the new schedule meant for the next 18 months. It was manageable. That was the word he kept arriving at. Not comfortable, not solved, manageable. Clara came and sat across from him with the tea she'd started making every evening, 2 cups without asking, because somewhere it had become the natural conclusion of the day. Put 1 cup near his hand and wrapped both hands around hers and looked at the window with the curtain. "Tell me about the land," she said. "The original land." "The acres." He looked up. "You've never told me how you came to have it," she said, "or how it became 10. It was not a simple story, and he told it simply. The way you describe a loss you've finished grieving, not without feeling, but with the distance of a thing that is settled. He had come to Dakota Territory 12 years ago. The partner, a man named Reese, who had been his oldest friend, and who had seen the same potential in the land that Elias saw. They had bought 60 acres together, 3 good years. Then a winter that killed half the cattle, then a debt to cover it. Then Reese's decision to take his half in cash and go south, which Elias had not predicted, and which had left him with 40 acres and a debt, and the particular isolation of a man who has outlasted the circumstances he planned for. The other 30 went in pieces, he said. Bad year, then another bad year. Vane bought each piece at the price I was in no position to argue with. He looked at his hands. I kept the 10 because it's the 10 the cabin is on. Can't sell the ground under your own house. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Reese. Do you know where he went?" "Texas, last I heard, years ago." "Did you look for him?" "No." He paused. "There wasn't anything to find by the time I could have looked." She nodded. She understood something in the pauses of this conversation that he had not said aloud, the shape of what losing Reese had meant, which was not only the land but the particular loneliness of a man who had trusted someone completely and been left with the consequences of that trust. She didn't say this. She just understood it, and the understanding was visible in the way she looked at him, which was carefully and without judgment. "The south pasture," she said, "the railroad route. If you had the land back, even part of it, what would you do with it?" He looked at her. The question was not hypothetical, or it was hypothetical in the way that some questions are pointing at a real thing through the safe cover of what if. "Same thing I was doing," he said. "Cattle, hay in summer. Maybe some winter wheat on the north section." He paused. "Good land. It was always good land. The land didn't fail." "Didn't." She picked up her tea, picked up his. They sat with the figure and the curtains and the fire and the sleeping child in the back room, and outside Vane was somewhere in his bank doing his calculations. And the valley was dark and cold, and full of people who had chosen today to be something other than silent. The next morning, Elias received a visitor he had not expected. The man arrived at the cabin door before 8, which meant he had ridden out from town in the dark or close to it. He was young, late 20s, possibly 30, in a coat that had seen better decades, and boots that had clearly walked a significant portion of the territory. He had the particular look of someone who had been traveling for some time, and had the complicated relationship with cleanliness that travel produces. He said his name was Garrett. He said he was a land surveyor, not employed by the railroad, self-employed, working on a private commission he declined to identify further. He said he had been in the territory for 6 weeks doing independent assessments of properties along the preliminary railroad route. He said he had found something in the county records. Elias stood in the doorway and looked at him. Clara had appeared behind Elias's shoulder. She had the awareness of someone who hears things before they become audible, and a stranger arriving before 8 in the morning qualified as something worth being aware of. "What did you find?" Elias asked. Garrett reached into the bag over his shoulder and produced a roll of papers. "The original survey of your land, the 60-acre parcel from 12 years ago." He unrolled part of it. "There's an error in the county recording. The boundary markers were transcribed wrong when the deed was filed. The south boundary of your property runs 12 feet further than the recorded deed shows." Elias stared at him. 12 feet. 12 feet at the western corner, which, given the angle of the property, translates to approximately 40 feet along the length of the south pasture. Garrett looked at him steadily. "The preliminary railroad route crosses your land at the corner. The deed recorded the correct boundary. The railroad route doesn't cross my land," Elias said. "It sits on the 12 feet of disputed margin," Garrett said, "which means the railroad company would have to renegotiate the route or establish the correct boundary through the county recorder, a process that, with a contested survey, could take months, possibly longer." Elias stood very still. He was doing the geography in his head, the south pasture, the corner Vane had been looking at, the line on the map. "Who commissioned you?" he asked. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "I'm not able to say. My client values their privacy." "Martha Doyle," Clara said from behind Elias's shoulder. Garrett said nothing, which was not a denial. "Come inside," Elias said. Cold. Garrett came inside. He spread the papers on the table, the original survey, the county recording, the comparison he had drawn up himself showing the discrepancy. He walked Elias through it point by point with the methodical care of someone who knows that what he is explaining matters and is taking no shortcuts. Clara stood at the edge of the table and followed the explanation with the focused attention she brought to most things, asking two questions that are precise and relevant, and that Garrett answered with respect, which registered with Elias as information about both of them. "The error works in your favor," Garrett said finally. "If you file a boundary correction with the county recorder and attach the original survey, the railroad has to deal with the corrected line. And a corrected line that puts the route off your property." "Still on someone's property," Elias said. "Yes, the adjacent parcel to the west." Garrett paused. "Which is owned outright by a family named Pruitt with no debt to any bank." Elias thought about Pruitt standing on the street yesterday, talking about calling Vane's debt. He thought about how Pruitt had said he was doing it for himself, not for Elias. "Pruitt knows," Elias said. "He was made aware, yes. And he's all right with it?" Garrett folded his papers with the care of a man who respects documents. "And I'm quoting directly, 'Let them route it through the corner of my north field. I'll charge them what it's worth and not a cent less. And Vane can find someone else to do his dirty work." He paused. He also said several other things, but those were the relevant parts. Elias sat down. He sat down in his own chair at his own table in his own cabin and looked at a survey map that had been wrong for 12 years and was now, through someone's careful attention to the county records and someone else's willingness to spend money they didn't mention spending, going to be right. He did not feel triumphant. He felt the particular sensation of a situation that has been pressing on you for a long time, releasing its pressure, which is different from happiness, and resembles it closely enough to be confusing. Clara put her hand on his shoulder. She did it briefly and without ceremony, as she did most things, and removed it before it became something that required acknowledgement. But it was there, and it was enough. Garrett left with his papers and a meal that Clara insisted on providing, which he ate quickly, and with the unself-conscious gratitude of a man who had been eating trail food and knew the difference. Elsie, who had woken during the conversation and installed herself under the table with a piece of cornbread, watched him go with the philosophical equanimity of a 2-year-old to whom most things were equally interesting. The filing at the county recorder's office took 4 days. Martha Doyle accompanied them, which turned out to matter because the recorder was a cautious man who moved slowly by nature, and moved considerably less slowly when Martha Doyle was in his office with a specific request and a specific expression. Vane learned about the boundary correction on the 4th day. Elias heard third-hand and without specifics that the reaction had been significant, that the word from the bank that afternoon was that Vane had sent 2 telegrams and made 3 calls to the railroad company's territorial office, and that the responses had not been satisfying. The route adjustment required a new survey, new negotiations, new filings. The timeline moved out by months. The railroad company, which had its own calculations and did not appreciate surprises from a land agent who had assured them the route was clear, was not pleased. Vane's position in this valley had rested on the certainty of the railroad deal. The certainty was now uncertain. Elias did not hear about Vane's reaction through Vane. He heard about it through the community that had, over the course of a difficult winter, found reasons to know his business and to care about it. Bess Trotter, Harlan, the Alderman family, half a dozen others who had their own reasons for watching the bank and its owner with more attention than they had managed before. The debt restructuring remained in effect. The loan modification Croft had brought out on the street stood. 18 months. Elias could manage 18 months. He came home on the evening of the day the filing was confirmed. He put the horses in the barn. He stood in the barn in the dark for a moment, listening to the horses and the wind and the particular silence of a night that has nothing threatening in it. Then he went inside. Clara was at the fire. Elsie was asleep. Curtains were on the windows. The cabin smelled like dinner and wood smoke, and the particular smell of a place that is lived in, that has been breathed in and breathed out by people going about the business of being alive. Done, Clara asked. It's done. He sat down. For now, she agreed. She brought him dinner. They sat at the table after, in the way they had developed the tea, the fire, the window, and Elias looked at the curtain and thought about 12 feet. 12 feet of ground that had always been his, and that he had not known was his, and that had changed everything by existing. You know what Vane's going to do next, Clara said. Find another angle. Yes, she looked at the fire. We need to be ready for it. We keep saying that. Keep being right. She paused. But we're still here. He looked at her. The fire moved. Outside, the wind found the east wall of the cabin and looked for gaps, and found fewer than it used to, because Elias had been filling them all winter one at a time. We're still here, he said. Elsie made a sound in the back room, not a cry, just the sound of a sleeping child adjusting position, taking up more space than seemed geometrically possible for someone so small. The sound settled back into quiet. The cabin held the night outside it, as it had held every night since December. Imperfectly, with patches showing and wood complaining in the cold, with a fire that needed constant attention, and a roof that had been repaired but would need repairing again. Not perfect, not finished, but holding Vane's next move came in February, which was when Elias had expected it, and also not exactly how he had expected it. The winter had not eased. If anything, February in Dakota Territory had opinions about January that were unfavorable, and expressed those opinions through 2 weeks of cold that settled into the bones of the land and stayed there. Cabin held. It always held imperfectly, with the fire eating wood faster than was comfortable, and the east wall finding new ways to let the temperature have opinions about the interior, but it held. What Vane did was quieter than the letter. He did not send correspondence. He did not make speeches in the saloon. He simply, through channels that Elias only understood afterward, began suggesting to the railroad company's territorial representative that the boundary dispute made the entire southern corridor unreliable, and that the company might consider an alternate route, entirely one that bypassed Redemption Bluff altogether and connected through the valley 20 miles to the north. An alternate route that would take the railroad away from the valley, away from every ranch and business and family that had built itself around the assumption that the railroad was coming. Harlan heard it first from a freight agent passing through. Harlan told Elias, standing in the feed store doorway, with his hands in his pockets and his face doing the complicated arithmetic of a man who is realizing that the problem is larger than he understood. He'd burn the whole valley to get back at you, Harlan said. It was not quite disbelief. Harlan had known Vane long enough for disbelief to be past more like the particular weariness of having a thing confirmed. He's not burning it to get back at me, Elias said. He's burning it to make everyone else get back at me. If the railroad moves north, every family in this valley knows it's because of the boundary dispute. Because of my land. Because he stopped. Because of Clara, Harlan said. That's what he'll tell them. Harlan was quiet for a moment. True? About the railroad moving? I don't know yet. You'd better find out fast. Elias found out through Garrett, who was still in the territory, and who had, it turned out, a more extensive network of professional contacts than his worn coat suggested. Garrett confirmed the conversations had happened. He also confirmed that the railroad company had not made a decision, that they were weighing the cost of the route adjustment against the cost of the northern alternative, and that the decision was not final, and that it would be made within 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Elias drove home and told Clara everything. He had stopped editing information for her. Somewhere around the second week of January, had stopped making the calculation of what she could handle and what she should be protected from, because the calculation was insulting, and she had demonstrated repeatedly that she handled things better with full information than without it. She listened. She asked 2 questions. Then she sat at the table for a long time without speaking, and Elias let her, because she thought in silence the way he thought in motion, and interrupting it was not useful. He's changed the target, she said finally. Yes. It's not us anymore. It's the valley. She looked at the table. Which means the people who came out on the street last month, he's turned them into potential enemies. If the railroad moves north, if they believe the railroad moved north because of us. She met his eyes. And he's counting on people not making it. Most people don't make it, Elias said, when they're frightened. I know, she paused. Who does the railroad company actually listen to? He thought about it honestly. Money and volume. Enough accounts in one bank, enough business routed through one freight agent that gets attention. Then we need to get there before Vane does, she stood. Not us. Martha. Martha Doyle, when presented with this information 2 days later at her organized house with its fire at its specific temperature, did not react with alarm. She reacted with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting for a particular move and recognizes it when it arrives. He's overreached, she said. How? Elias asked. If the railroad moves, the valley blames us. If the railroad moves, the valley loses freight capacity, connection to eastern markets, and 10 years of planned growth. She said it with the precision of someone who had been thinking about the valley's economics for 30 years. Families here aren't stupid. They can follow a line from cause to effect. Vane convinced them to let him run the bank for 20 years by being the cause and making the effect invisible. She looked at her hands. This time the effect is too large to hide. You think they'll see it? I think enough of them will. She paused. I'm going to write to the railroad company's district office. Not as a private citizen, as the representative of 37 family accounts currently held with the Redemption Bluff Savings Bank. She said it without flourish. And I'm going to suggest that the company's relationship with this valley is best served by a route that reflects the surveyed boundaries of existing properties, and that any representative who would prefer the northern route should be prepared to explain that preference to 37 families who vote in territorial elections. Elias looked at her. You have the standing to speak for 37 families? I will by Thursday, she said. I'll make calls tomorrow. She made the calls. Elias did not hear all of them. Martha operated with the discretion of someone who understood that too many witnesses complicated things, but he heard enough through the community's ordinary channels to understand what was happening. Called on each family. She explained the situation clearly, without inflating the threat or minimizing it. She asked each family a direct question. Did they want to sign a letter of joint representation to the railroad company's district office? 31 of the 37 said yes. The other 6 were Vane's people, or close enough to it that the distinction didn't matter. The letter went out on a Friday, carried by a writer who made the journey to the district office in 2 days, because Martha paid for speed. The letter stated, in the careful and precise language of a woman who had been composing important correspondence for 50 years, that the landholders of the Redemption Bluff Valley had reviewed the preliminary route survey, supported the corrected boundary filing of the Crow property, and considered any alternative routing that would bypass the valley to be a matter of grave concern that they would bring to the attention of the territorial legislature at the earliest opportunity. It was a warning with 31 signatures and the weight of collective economic interest behind it. The railroad company's response arrived 10 days later. The alternate route was not under active consideration. The boundary correction was acknowledged. The original corridor would be surveyed with updated coordinates. Construction timeline unchanged. Vane received this information on a Wednesday afternoon. Elias heard about it from Harlan, who heard about it from Croft, who had apparently found his conscience sometime in January, and had been quietly keeping Harlan informed of relevant developments. He sat at his desk for an hour without moving. Croft had reportedly told Harlan. Then he started writing letters. To who, Elias had asked. Harlan shrugged. That I don't know. But his hands were shaking when he wrote them. The letters, it turned out, were to the bank's parent institution in the territorial capital, a larger financial entity that Vane answered to and had always treated as a formality, because Redemption Bluff was small enough and remote enough that the parent institution rarely paid close attention. The letters were Vane's attempt to explain why his strategy for the railroad land acquisition had not proceeded as planned. The parent institution, which had its own interests in the railroad deal and had been counting on Vane's management of the situation, was not satisfied with the explanation. An auditor arrived in March. The auditor was a small, quiet man named Fitch, who wore spectacles and asked questions with the methodical patience of someone who intends to find what he is looking for and has time. He spent 2 weeks in the bank. He reviewed the loan records, the deed transactions, the collateral assessments. He reviewed the Alderman property acquisition, the Brecker property, the Hollis family case. He reviewed Elias's loan modification and the original terms and the letter that had demanded full payment in 7 days. Elias was called to speak with Fitch on a Thursday morning. He went alone, leaving Clara with Elsie, and sat across from the auditor, in the same chair he had sat in, across from Vane 2 months earlier, and answered questions for 90 minutes. He told the truth. The whole truth, including the parts that showed him in a difficult light the years of debt, the bad decisions, the land lost piece by piece. He did not perform victimhood, and he did not minimize the bank's legitimate interest in the debt. He just described what had happened, in order, accurately. Fitch wrote things down and asked follow-up questions, and thanked Elias for his time. 3 weeks later, Silas Vane resigned as president of the Redemption Bluff Savings Bank. Parent institution announced that the bank would be operated under new management, pending a permanent appointment. The auditor's findings were not made public, but the consequences of them were, in the way that things in small communities are public without being announced. Vane left Redemption Bluff on a Tuesday morning with 2 trunks, and the expression of a man who has been engaged in a long argument with reality and has finally conceded the argument, though not gracefully. He did not say goodbye to anyone, because goodbye implies a mutual acknowledgement of a relationship, and Vane had spent 20 years insisting the relationships in this valley were purely transactional. Elias heard about his departure from Harlan, standing in the same feed store doorway where they had stood in February. Gone, Harlan said. Took the morning stage. Where to? Don't imagine it matters. Didn't matter. What mattered was that the bank, under its temporary management, honored the loan modification. What mattered was that the debt, which had been Elias's companion and tormentor for 3 years, was on a schedule that allowed for the possibility of a future that didn't involve it. Spring arrived the way. Spring arrives on the frontier, not gently, not with the ceremony that people who have not lived through a Dakota winter imagine it might have, but practically. The ice broke on the creek, the ground softened. The south pasture, which had been frozen solid since November, turned to mud and then to something that had color in it, the particular exhausted green of ground waking up. Elias stood at the fence line of the south pasture on an April morning and looked at his land. All of it, the 10 acres he had held onto, through everything, and the 12 feet that had always been his without his knowing, and the 30 acres that had been sold and were not going to be bought back tomorrow, or perhaps ever. He looked at what was there rather than what wasn't. He was practicing this, had been practicing it all winter, and was better at it than he had been in December, without being entirely good at it. Clara came up beside him. She had Elsie by the hand, and Elsie was wearing boots that were slightly too large for her, because she had grown through the winter in the way of children who are warm and fed and given stories about dogs. She looked at the pasture with the same frank assessment she gave most things. Mud, Elsie said with satisfaction. A lot of it, Elias agreed. I want to touch it. I know you do. She looked at him with the expression of someone who recognizes a non-answer and is considering her options. Then she looked at her mother. Clara looked back at her. If you touch the mud, you will be covered in mud. You know this. Elsie considered the calculus of this. Then she sat down in the mud, not touched it, sat in it. Fully, with the decisive commitment of a person who has identified the natural conclusion of a situation and arrived there without hesitation. Elias looked at Clara. Clara looked at Elias. She's thorough, Clara said. She is, he agreed. Something happened then that had not happened yet between them, not in all the weeks of the winter, not through the crisis and the street and the bank and the auditor. Not a polite acknowledgement of something amusing, not the controlled half-smile he had produced occasionally. A full laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere you forgot, was available, and Clara laughed too, and Elsie, who had no idea what was funny but found the sound extremely satisfying, laughed as well from the mud, and the south pasture on an April morning held all of it without difficulty. He proposed to her 2 days later, not down on one knee, not with the speech prepared. He was fixing the gate on the barn. It had been problematic all winter, and had finally agreed to be addressed, and Clara was nearby mending something, and the morning was quiet, and he said, without turning from the gate, I want to marry you. I know the timing isn't, yes, she said. Turned. She was looking at him over the mending, and her expression was the straightforward kind, the one that didn't hedge. I didn't finish the sentence, he said. You said enough. I was going to say the timing isn't conventional. The timing is fine, Clara said. We've been living like a family for 4 months. The paperwork is overdue. He looked at her. You're not romantic about this. I'm extremely romantic about this. I'm just also practical. She picked up the mending again. The ceremony can be small. Martha will have opinions about it. Martha has opinions about everything. Yes, and she's usually right. Clara paused. Elsie will want to hold flowers. She's been talking about flowers for 2 weeks. Where is she getting information about wedding flowers? Mrs. Harlan. They've been corresponding. Elias stared at her. Elsie is too. She can't write. She tells me what she wants to say, and I write it, and Mrs. Harlan writes back, and I read it to her. Clara's expression was entirely serious. It's a functional correspondence. He turned back to the gate. He was smiling at the gate, which was an undignified thing to do, but the gate did not tell anyone. The ceremony was small the way Clara meant it, which was about 30 people in the open space between the cabin and the barn. On a morning, in late April, when the weather had decided to cooperate, the frontier did occasionally and without advance notice. Martha was there, and Harlan and his wife, and Pruitt with his family, and Bess Trotter, and Dr. Hale and the Alderman family, and a dozen others who had become, through the winter's events, something more than neighbors. Elsie held flowers. She had been given a specific bunch wild flowers gathered from the south pasture, which had produced them unexpectedly, as if the land was doing its part, and she held them with the absolute seriousness of someone executing an important commission. She walked between her mother and Elias with the deliberate concentration of a small person who knows the occasion is significant and intends to behave accordingly. She dropped the flowers twice. The second time, she regarded them on the ground for a moment, picked them back up, and continued without changing her expression. The people watching found this more moving than the formal parts, because it was honest. And honesty in small packages tends to land harder than honesty in large ones. Hale said the words, because no one in Redemption Bluff wanted a man of the cloth in the middle of a civic matter, and Hale had been saying important words over important occasions for 40 years and knew how to do it without theater. He said what marriage was not what it should be in some ideal world, but what it actually was. A choice made with incomplete information about the future. A bet placed not on certainty, but on the person standing beside you. Elias and Clara made the bet. Afterward, there was enough food that it became evident. Martha had been organizing this aspect of the event for longer than anyone admitted in conversation, and Elsie ate something sticky that Mrs. Harlan had brought and distributed its remains equally between her own dress and Elias's sleeve without apparent concern. Pruitt came and stood with Elias while Clara was talking with Martha and Hale. He had a plate of food in one hand, and the general appearance of a man who has something to say and is figuring out how to say it. Railroad surveys done, he said. North corner of my field is the line. They're going to need a small easement maybe 20 feet across the corner for the rail bed. Trouble? Elias asked. Negotiated it last week. They paid fair. Pruitt ate something from the plate. More than fair, actually. Once I showed them I had a lawyer from the Capitol looking at the agreement. He paused. Garrett recommended the lawyer. Garrett's been useful. Very. Pruitt looked across the yard at the gathering. Vane had this valley convinced that things only worked one way. His way. Bank holds the leverage, everyone else adjusts. He shook his head. Didn't occur to him that leverage runs different directions. It was a plain observation, the kind Pruitt made without decoration. But Elias sat with it because it was true, and because it was the thing he had been learning all winter in real time, through his own skin, in ways that were expensive and clarifying. Vane had been so certain of the direction things moved down from him to everyone else that he had never considered the other direction. He had never considered that 31 families signing a letter might weigh more than one banker's relationship with a railroad company. He had never considered that a woman with no legal standing, no family connections, and no money could become someone a community would stand behind in the cold on a main street. He had never considered that the things he had classified as vulnerability, Elias's debt, Clara's origins, Elsie's existence might become, in the right conditions, something else entirely. The right conditions being roughly people who showed up when showing up was needed. The summer that followed was not easy because the frontier did not arrange itself for ease. Cattle needed managing. The hay needed cutting. The barn roof required an intervention in June that ate 2 weeks of work. The loan servicing took a bite out of every month that had to be planned around carefully. There were arguments, small ones, mostly. The arguments of two people learning to share a life who had both spent long periods managing alone and had strong habits about how things were done. Clara had opinions about the cold storage. Elias had opinions about the cold storage too, and his opinions were wrong, which became apparent in July when her system kept the summer stores in better condition than his ever had, and he acknowledged this with the minimum number of words required. She did not gloat. She was not a gloater. She simply continued being right about the cold storage, which was its own statement. Elsie turned 3 in March and became, if anything, more herself, more talkative, more interested in everything, more likely to be found in places she had not been given permission to be. She had adopted the barn cats as personal dependents and had opinions about their welfare. She had learned to follow Elias on his morning rounds and ask questions about everything she observed, and the questions were often good ones, which he answered honestly, including the ones that didn't have easy answers. "Why does that cow look sad?" Elsie asked, regarding one of the cattle through the fence one morning in June. "She's not sad. She's just thinking." "What's she thinking about?" "Grass, probably." Elsie considered this. "I think about grass sometimes." "Do you?" "When I'm hungry." She looked at him with the direct gaze she had inherited from her mother. "Are you happy?" He looked at her. The question came from nowhere and landed directly, the way Elsie's questions did no approach. No runway, just the thing itself. "Yes," he said. She nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected, and went back to watching the cow. Thought about that question later, standing at the fence of the south pasture in the early evening with the light going gold over the valley. He thought about what happy meant in the context of a life that was still hard, that had not resolved into ease, that required constant attention and produced no guarantees. He thought about the word in the way you think about it when someone who doesn't know its complications asks it plainly. He was. Not in the way of a man who has gotten everything he wanted. He had not gotten everything he wanted, and some of what he had lost was not coming back. But in the way of a man who has found, in the middle of an honest reckoning with his own limitations and the world's indifference, something worth the trouble of continuing. Clara came to stand beside him. She did that in the evening, sometimes found him at the fence line, and stood with him for a while without requiring conversation to be the point. "Elsie asked me today why we didn't go back to Boston," she said. "What did you tell her?" "I told her this is home." She paused. She said, "I know that. I'm asking why Boston wasn't." Clara shook her head. "She's 3. She listens to things," Elias said. "Too much." But her voice had that quality, the warmth behind the dryness, the thing that was always there underneath. "She's going to be formidable. She already is." Yes, Clara looked at the valley. The light was doing what it did out here in summer, stretching long and gold over everything, making the land look the way a person imagines the frontier looking when they are somewhere else entirely, and the frontier is still a possibility rather than a reality. "I wrote to Daniel's family," she said. He looked at her. "Not asking for anything, not explaining myself." She kept her eyes on the valley. "I told them Elsie as well that she's growing, that she has people who love her." She paused. "I thought Elsie deserves to have it on record somewhere that someone told them." "What do you think they'll do with it?" "Nothing, probably." A pause. "Maybe nothing. People surprise you sometimes." He thought about Pruitt on the street, about Bess Trotter's bag of provisions, about Martha making calls on a Tuesday so that 31 families had signed a letter by Friday, about Harlan, who had his own debt to Vane and had stood on that street anyway. "They do," he said. She leaned slightly against his arm. Not dramatically, just a shift of weight. A small closing of the distance between them. He did not move. He let the warmth of it stand for what it was. The south pasture spread out in front of them, green and imperfect and entirely real. He had thought in the winter's worst moments that what he was trying to protect was land. 10 acres, a piece of surveyed ground with a deed and a debt attached to it. He had thought the fight was about property. It wasn't about property. It was about the difference between a place you are holding on to out of stubbornness and exhaustion and a place that has become, through the accumulation of small, ordinary things, a child's laughter, 2 cups of tea, curtains on windows, a functional correspondence about flowers, somewhere that belongs to you, not because of a document, but because of what happened inside it. Elias had lived on this land for 6 years before he understood that. You can hold a thing for a long time without knowing why. You can survive in a place, manage it, maintain it, carry it through difficulty after difficulty with the grim efficiency of someone who has decided that fix it is not an option without ever asking yourself what exactly you are staying for. It takes something to break through that, not comfort, not success, not the resolution of the practical problems, which never resolve entirely. It takes someone showing up unexpected and being willing to build something in the same cold with whatever is available. Clara had not come west to save him. She had come west to save herself and her daughter, which is a different thing, and it is a truer one. And it is the kind of thing that tends to produce better outcomes than rescue. Because people who are saving themselves bring their full capacity to the effort and don't wait to be thanked. What they had built was not a rescue. It was something more like what Pruitt had described, without intending the poetry of it, leverage running in different directions. 2 people whose respective resources, his land, her competence, his stubbornness, her clarity, Her daughter, who sat in mud and held flowers and asked unanswerable questions, directly combined into something that was harder to move than either of them had been alone. Vane had understood everything about the situation except that. He had looked at a struggling rancher and a widow with a child and seen weakness aggregated. He had not considered that two people who have both survived considerable difficulty are not weakened by each other's presence. They are, if the circumstances are right, consolidated. He had never considered the circumstances being right. That was his error. Not the railroad, not the survey, not the letter, those were consequences. The error was earlier and more fundamental. The belief that difficulty diminishes people, and that a man or a woman who has been reduced in the world's accounting is reduced in every accounting that matters. The frontier taught the opposite, if you paid attention. The frontier was indifferent to your past and unimpressed by your intentions, and deeply interested in what you actually did on any given day. It did not grade on a curve of prior suffering. It did not reward victimhood or punish ambition, or keep any record other than the one being made right now, in the cold with whatever you had. What Elias had in December was almost nothing. What Clara had was less than that. What they had built from it was not wealth, not security in any absolute sense, not the resolution of all the hard things. It was a life that was genuinely theirs chosen, maintained, difficult, and worth the difficulty. Elsie would grow up knowing that. She would grow up in a house where things were built rather than inherited, where the community was made rather than assumed, where the people around her had looked at hard circumstances and decided those circumstances did not get the last word. She would grow up with Elias reading to her in the evening, and Clara teaching her the practical knowledge that kept a household alive, and Martha Doyle's influence moving through the valley like something that didn't need to announce itself to have effect. She would grow up, in other words, with everything that had nearly been taken from her. The night she arrived at a freezing train station in the arms of a woman who had run out of options, but not out of will. The light finished its work on the valley and pulled back toward the horizon. Cattle moved in the south pasture. Somewhere in the cabin behind them, a tin cup was being relocated with a sound that suggested Elsie had woken from her nap and was engaged in independent activities. "We should go in," Clara said. Yes, neither of them moved immediately. There was a moment between the knowing and the moving in which the valley held them there at the fence line with the last of the evening on it, and the world was exactly this and nothing else. Then they turned and walked back toward the cabin, and the door opened, and the sound of a child who has located something interesting spilled out into the April evening, and the light went behind the hills, and the day closed down the way days do without ceremony, without announcement, simply done, and the next one waiting. This is what the frontier gives. When it gives anything at all, not permanence, not safety, not the resolution of difficulty. It gives you the day you're in, and the people in it with you, and the work that needs doing, and the chance to do it. The whole offer. It always was. Most people, given enough time, come to understand that the offer is enough. Elias Crow had come to understand it on a frozen December platform, in 8 steps, crossing a distance he almost hadn't crossed, toward a woman he hadn't known he was waiting for. Everything after that was just the living of it, the end.